under the guise of public health, using the vehicle of fear. With the promise of security, our government in an instant took all our freedoms away.
Healthcare workers went from heroes to zeros. I was a VA employee for 20 years, forced out due to the mandates.
We went from 2 weeks to flatten the curve to 3 shots to feed your family. But the real pandemic was the division created between friends and family.
It does not take a majority to prevail. It takes an irate and tireless minority, keen on setting brush fires of freedom in the minds of men. We're here to fight every single morsel of this nonsense, and I'm just getting started, and so are you.
America is made up of small communities just like ours. We need to unite in our battle for freedom.
People are starting to realize that the pharmaceutical industry has undue influence over the federal government. That's why we need to stand up and fight at the local level.
Freedom of speech and thought is being massacred. We have a society that is raising wimps.
The sheep will be sheep. We're not going to waste our time with them.
I know a lot of people that express that they've lost family members, friends, business colleagues over basically a difference of opinion.
Ours is not to know how this ends. Ours is not to know when the bondage will finally disappear. Ours is to act. Ours is to stand up. Ours is to rage. Ours is to become soldiers for the truth. That is what we do.
Here's the biggest secret that they don't want you to know. That we are many and they are few.
They want us to continue to be divided, whether it's about race, whether it's about vaccines, whether it's about politics. They want to push us apart, so we need to come together.
This is truly biblical. Good versus evil.
The creator of the universe has given us our freedom and inalienable rights that only come from him.
Seek truth and spread information. Be the light that shines on the darkness and flushes it out.
And you already know how the story ends. God wins.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Nicole from Mask Off, Minnesota. Happy New Year. This is our first Zoom meeting in the new year 2024. And our guests today are Ken McCarthy, who, if you've been part of Mask Off, is not a stranger to you. This is his 4th meeting with Mask Off Minnesota. He's been a supporter of our group from the get-go. He's an internet marketing pioneer, an author. He runs Brass Check TV. And he was on our meeting with Medical Justice Minnesota last year, just for a little bit at the end, talking about his book, What the Nurses Saw, which is what we're going to talk about here today. We also have Mark Bashofsky with us, who, again, if you're a Mask Off Minnesota member, you know who he is. He was in our video, who will talk a little bit about the protocols regarding the ventilation. So welcome to everyone tonight. Now, this is the book that we are going to dive into today a little bit, What the Nurses Saw, and Ken graciously has offered to provide everyone who's live with us today a free digital copy. So if you do want to download the digital copy, go to maskoffmn.org/Ken's book and download it right now. Now we're going to do a little poll, as we always do at all of our meetings. And our first poll is, hold on, David's working, our tech guy. Have you attended a Mask Off Minnesota event in the past? So please vote right now. Wow.
All All right, we have about 70% of the vote in, so we'll just give the folks here just another moment or two, Nicole, and we'll end and share the results right now. Here we go. And it looks like this is the first time. We have 30% of our attendees a first time here today. So welcome, everyone, first timers. Nice to have you on board. And then we have, let's see here, about 50% of us have attended a Mask Off Minnesota event virtually, so welcome back. And about 46% of us have attended in-person events, so a little bit of crossover there. So welcome to all of our returning members. Thank you very much for joining us here again. And we have one more poll here. Let's go ahead and launch that one, Nicole.
Do you know someone that has been a victim of the COVID CDC hospital protocols personally?
Now, we did, of course, ask this question last month. We had Medical Justice Minnesota on. And obviously, all of those folks, the members of that group, all voted yes on this. But curious what everyone else is saying here. So let's end and share the results here. We've got 70% of the vote in. Just give a few more seconds here. 3, 2, 1, and looks like 63% of our attendees tonight say yes, they have known someone has been a victim of the COVID CDC hospital protocols, and 37% say no, they don't believe so. So very, very interesting.
Wow, that's a really large number, but shall we dive in right now, David? Are we ready?
Let's do it.
Let's do it. All right, Ken McCarthy, you wrote the book, What the Nurses Saw. Now, we have Mark Bashofsky here, who's an airway specialist. So before I go to Mark, I want to ask you, Ken, what made you write this book? Why did you write this book?
Can I say something quick? First, Happy New Year, everybody. And two, the last meeting we gave out a PDF of the book. If you got it the last time, get the new one and delete the old one. The old one had some things that were in error, like we said that Ron Johnson was the senator from Minnesota. That's kind of embarrassing. But hey, I'm from New York. What can I say? So there were little errors like that. We'd like the thing with errors not to be floating around. We'd like the good one to be floating around. So even if you've got the old one, get the new one, download it, delete the old one if you would, and share it. It's free. You can just share it for free. And then the other thing is consider buying the book, because it pushes up. We have been the #1 ranking book in several nurse categories, including nurse-patient relationships on Amazon. And that's a result of sales. And the nurses see that, and the academicians see that, and the nursing school libraries see that. So it makes an impact. So why did I write this book? Wow. I saw 2 nurses come out very early on in the scamdemic, the panic, and they were saying the most remarkable things. They were flat out saying, we're killing our patients, which is a pretty extreme statement to hear. And I followed up with one of them, Nurse Erin Marie, and can somebody help me with her last name?
Olson, I think.
What's that?
I think it's Erin Marie Olson, I think.
Oh, it's not Olson. I wish it was Olson.
Okay.
But she's getting married again. I think her new name's going to be Malone. But in fact, I wish I had her book handy, but she wrote a book too. Anyway, so I followed up with her in the late spring of 2020, so very early on, and I did a very in-depth interview. And before I talked with her, I looked up, what does it mean to vent somebody or to intubate somebody? And I think we all heard those terms, and I'm going to guess that unless you work in a hospital setting, you probably don't have a clue. And when I saw what venting and intubation is, I was shocked that this is not in any way, by any stretch of the imagination, a minor medical procedure. This takes a great deal of skill, a great deal of careful supervision. So when I learned that there was only one respiratory therapist for 300 people in an intensive care unit in a city hospital in New York, I mean, that's a recipe for death. I mean, it's just, there's no other way to put it. And then I learned that from Erin and some other nurses early on, well, actually from Erin particularly, that there were nurses and doctors who were allowed to come in from overseas to work in our hospitals. And previous to this, I don't think that's ever been allowed. I think even if you were a great physician in another country with you could be a professor, you could be published 1,000 papers, but you can't practice medicine in the United States unless, there she is, Nurse Erin. Thank you so much. you can't just waltz over here and start practicing medicine. You have to jump through all the hoops. Well, when the COVID panic came along, they just made that law go away, and you had these privately owned employment agencies that specialize in medical personnel just opening the floodgates to any and all people from all countries. I'd love to see an in-depth study and research on that, because I wonder how many of them even had MDs, because I can't imagine that the due diligence was that strict. Not only did these people not have American certification for practicing medicine, a lot of them were language challenged. English was not their first language. They were having a lot of trouble making themselves understood and understanding. And then the pièce de résistance was some of these guys didn't even have relevant medical experience. They were pediatricians, they were gynecologists, and they were put in ICUs. And Mark, let's jump into that. Does that make any sense to you at all? That you would put somebody without ICU experience in an ICU in an emergency situation?
No, I mean, it's like you've said in the past, Ken, it's like, you don't want a podiatrist, a foot doctor running a ventilator. They're just not trained in that. They get maybe a week's worth of, in their rotation as a resident, they might get one rotation through an intensive care unit, but they, for the most part, they don't have a clue.
So they've gotten their medical degree, good. They've passed the boards, good. Maybe they once had a brief demonstration class in intubation, and now they're a podiatrist or a gynecologist or an obstetrician or a orthopedic guy, and now suddenly they're trying to intubate people. And let's be graphic about what does it mean to intubate somebody, and this will give us a clue as to, if you have the wrong person doing the job, they're going to be errors, and the errors can be fatal. So what does it mean when we say somebody's being intubated?
Yeah, so I mean, the errors could go, when it comes to intubation and running a ventilator, you could have errors at the beginning in placing the tube. You could do the wrong size tube. You could put it in the esophagus. You could put it too deep, all the way through to running the ventilator. But when someone's on a ventilator, first you have to intubate them with a tube, an endotracheal tube. That tube goes through the mouth, down into the trachea, and then there's a balloon at the end of that tube, which kind of seals off the trachea. It's a big tube. I mean, a lot of times, just like kind of as a joke, we'll call it like a garden hose in the hospital. I mean, it's big. It is a very uncomfortable procedure. You need to be, fully sedated. Anybody who's awake at all when this is happening is going to fight it. I mean, even if you're sick, you're going to fight this procedure, because it's a massive tube going down your throat. I mean, it gags you, so you're going to require all kinds of sedation. There's like different sedatives, anesthetics they'll give for that. And then a lot of times, especially with COVID, they'll give a paralytic medicine to kind of, and that's used to get them to be still, but it also makes sure their vocal cords stay open, because you're putting that tube between the vocal cords. So just right there, it's just, it is a very invasive and can be dangerous procedure. I mean, typically, like, anyone who goes in for like a hip surgery or any kind of surgery that's pretty major is going to get intubated for a few hours, and in those cases, the worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to come out of there with maybe a sore throat. I mean, it's very, it's a short period of time. The duration's short. Most of the time you're going to be fine. But in these situations with COVID, first of all, you require all the sedation medications, and you need to do continued sedation, because even after that tube's in, it is extraordinarily uncomfortable. I mean, I can't speak from experience. I've not had one in, but I've seen thousands of patients with these things in. And I'm the person in the intensive cares that extubates, that when they're ready to pull that tube out, I'm there to extubate. And you would not believe, because you have to lighten sedation to pull it out to make sure they're breathing. And they are flipping out. They want that tube out worse than anything. And you also have to restrain these patients, because your natural instinct, even if you're sedated, is to reach up and grab it. And if they tried to pull that thing out, that balloon in there would rip their vocal cords potentially. It's just dangerous. So they need to be sedated, heavily sedated, probably paralyzed, They need to be restrained, soft restraints tied to the bed. And you also run the risk of infection. Anytime you put a foreign object into the body, you run the risk of infection. And after you've intubated, many times you're going to require other lines for medications, arterial blood gases. So you're running more risk of infection secondary to the intubation to have more lines. You're also running, so you run the risk of pneumonia or like a sepsis type of infection in the blood if you get an infection in one of the lines. And then you also, when you put this tube in, you're also, the cascade of more medication is inevitable because you're messing with your blood pressure. When you're intubated, you're breathing, the ventilator's pushing air in, positive pressure. We normally breathe negative pressure. Our chest, it becomes a vacuum. Your rib cage moves out, you create that vacuum, negative pressure, the flow is drawn in. With a ventilator, it's positive pressure, so that positive intrathoracic pressure changes your blood pressure too. So you're going to need blood pressure medications, you're going to need antibiotics, you're going to need sedatives, you're going to need paralytics. And then based on those medications, you're going to need more medications. Not to even mention how unnatural, like I said, we breathe via negative pressure, not to mention how the shearing pressures of the ventilator pushing on your fragile alveoli, the tissues in your lungs are extremely fragile. So, I mean, it's not something I ever want. And typically in the past, it was always something that was done emergently. It wasn't something you would do electively. It's just that dangerous. In fact, when I first started as a respiratory therapist in 1999, I remember at the University Hospital in Minnesota, I went to a symposium, many top doctors there. They'd done a huge study throughout the whole system over the course of a couple of years, and they found that for whatever reason, if anyone was intubated, the risk of mortality and morbidity went up 25%. And that's pre-COVID. So that just tells you right there how dangerous it is to intubate.
Gotcha. Let's talk about a couple of these details, and I want to go back to pre-COVID when people were intubated and during COVID, and we're still in the COVID era, and that's a very important message in this book, which didn't dawn on me until I'd already finished the book and put it out. The protocols that we're talking about, which are extreme and need to be handled by skilled people, not random people from random countries with random expertise. These protocols are still being used today, and patients are still dying from the protocols right now as we speak. So this is not a book about the ancient past. This is a book about an ongoing problem. Related to that, this whole system whereby somebody in Washington, D.C. can cook up a series of protocols, because it's not just the venting and the intubation and venting. There's a whole bunch of other things that went on. Where you could have bureaucrats in Washington decree that this is how it will be, and then put really significant financial incentives to incentivize the hospitals and the hospital administrators to do it in a certain way, and then put in basically punishment mechanisms, enforcement mechanisms that if I get a chance to describe them tonight, you'll see they're really iron fist. So you were talking about all the different drugs, Mark, that are required. These aren't, you don't just pop a pill, right? These are intravenous lines being from a bag that's hung.
Correct.
So it could be.
I can't think of them all, but propofol, Versed, fentanyl will be used, Precedex, and then the paralytics, succinylcholine, I believe, is a common one. They're going to need to be put to sleep in order to tolerate having that tube put in.
And for as long as they're under the procedure, they're going to be having these drugs coursing through their veins. And, no drug is 100% safe. And then when you have multiple drugs, that's got to, I'm just guessing, that's got to increase the risk. And then the duration. And let's talk about the duration. There was a bonus paid by the federal government to hospitals that intubated COVID patients. So if you got a positive COVID test, now if they could get you on a vent, they got a big payday. But I learned from the research in the book that there was an additional bonus if you held the patient for 96 hours and 1 second, I guess, on the vent. So let's talk about that, Mark. I'm guessing, given the severity of this procedure, once you vented somebody, you kind of want to take them off as soon as you can.
Absolutely.
You don't want to prolong it just for the sake of making a few bucks.
Yeah, absolutely. Where to go with that? When early on, there was this whole concept of early intubation. So they were intubating electively way before anyone really needed intubation. And how many of those people died because they were intubated? Probably most. I would imagine some of those folks probably could have been extubated, had the tube pulled out within a day or two. I can't speak from experience a lot because at that point in the scamdemic, I wasn't seeing a lot of intubated patients. But to me, that was the biggest crime of all, is the concept of early intubation. But yeah, to answer your question as far as duration, yes, you historically, I've been doing this 24 years. In fact, I'm working back in a hospital now, and every single day we're doing weaning trials. We're trying to get, and not seeing a lot of intubated. I haven't seen one intubated COVID patient in the 6 weeks I've been back. So it hasn't really come back, at least where I'm at. But yeah, you want to get these people off that ventilator as soon as possible. Every single day we're doing a weaning trial. We're turning the ventilator. We're doing a sedation holiday where we turn that sedation down, see if they can wake up a little, even though it's uncomfortable for them, see how well they can breathe. We turn the support on the ventilator down. The level of support that's helping to assist the breathing is turned down to see what the patient can do. So yeah, it is imperative. It's just it's nasty. It's dangerous. You want to get it off as soon as possible.
So every 24 hours, you're doing those tests to see, hey, is this patient strong enough to breathe on their own?
Yep. I mean, and if they're already on like really high support, you're at least going to attempt to turn that support down. But if they're on a moderate to low level support, you're going to put it in what we call a spontaneous mode. Because in ventilation, you can set a rate. Like, all right, this ventilator is going to deliver 20 breaths a minute at this pressure or this tidal volume. But you can then turn that rate off. So the patient has to trigger that breath on their own, and then there's a little assist in the pressure to overcome the resistance of the tube. But you can basically allow that patient to, trigger their own breaths. So they can be pretty awake during that period of time, and it's not comfortable for them. But yeah, every day we're attempting to decrease the support or wean them off.
So this implies close observation of the patients who are intubated and vented. You don't just vent them and then leave them in the room and don't see them again for 24 hours. But this is what was happening. Patients were pretty much abandoned, at least according to the reports I'm getting from the nurses that I spoke with who are in the book. They were abandoned. There were even some extreme cases where they had the array of drug bags. Instead of having them in the room next to the patient, so that the attending nurse could, when they changed the bags, could take a look at the patient. Is the patient getting better? Is the patient getting worse? Do I need to talk to the doctor? The bags were kept in the hallway, and there was long lines going into the patients. And the nurses, some nurses in some hospitals, were instructed to not even go into the rooms. So, Mark, just tell us how unprecedented and how fundamentally lunatic that kind of a setup is.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. I mean, we have to check our ventilators every 4 hours minimum, but we're really kind of just hanging around them all day. There's a respiratory therapist on 24/7, 365. And, I worked last night and I was busy and I had 4 ventilators and a couple other patients I was seeing, and I was busy. And I was hanging around that unit the entire time. I looked at those ventilators 2-3 times. And I was only there for a 5-hour shift, just a short one. And I was looking at, constantly monitoring. What are the pressures? Does the patient need to be suctioned? What is that alarm? It needs to be monitored. Just continue.
Is suction removing fluid from the lungs?
Yeah. So you can, we listen to their breath sounds. You can typically hear if there are secretions in there, and, we suction at least every 4 hours, if not more often if it's required. So that's an important thing, making sure that the tube stays clear. You don't want thick secretions clogging that tube up. You don't want the patient's lung filling up with, sputum, secretions, whatever you want to call it, phlegm. So yeah, we're, constantly monitoring the breath sounds. We're monitoring the oxygen level on the monitor. We're monitoring what the machine is delivering. We're monitoring whether or not that endotracheal tube is moved. Every 2 to 4 hours, I'm looking how many centimeters is it at the teeth to make sure it hasn't moved one way or the other. I mean, there's just a lot involved with it.
Well, every time I talk with you, Mark, or any of the nurses, I learn new things that I didn't know. The idea that the drainage was an ongoing thing, that you were checking the line constantly. So, and now here you are, 24 years of experience, and you were, you could handle 4 patients, but they kept you busy. Can you imagine a situation where you have 40, 50, 100, 200, an entire floor in a big hospital with one respiratory therapist? I mean, it would be physically, it would be impossible to care for the patients correctly. And, I know we're getting into some kind of, this might be hard for civilians to hear some of the details of this, but Mark, if you're not doing all those things, aren't you increasing the chances that the patient is going to die? If you're not draining on a regular basis, making sure the lines are clear. So when the nurses tell us that there was, maybe one respiratory therapist per floor, that the guy in charge wasn't even an ICU specialist, that the nurses were being told don't even go into the rooms. Then there's there's the issue of cleaning. These patients need to be cleaned regularly because they can't take care of themselves. And we had reports from more than one nurse that the patients were not even being cleaned. So they were pretty much, at least in the early months, and perhaps extending into it, were put on these vents and not supervised, not taken care of. And the attitude that was floating around, especially in the city hospitals in New York City, which was sort of ground zero for all this, was they're not going to live anyway. And the nurses that I interviewed were outraged, horrified, fought back, pushed back. And maybe we should talk a little bit about that. And these are veteran people. These are not, green nurses that, just came out of school and didn't know what they were talking about. These are nurses that had been in combat zones, nurses that had been in field hospitals for refugees in Syria, nurses with, a decade plus experience, just hardcore experienced people. And when they pointed out that what was going on was wrong, they were sometimes demoted. For instance, one of the nurses in the book, who was one of the ones that worked in the Syrian field hospital as a volunteer, she's an American nurse. She was also certified, I call it air ambulance because I think it's what people can understand. They have a different term, but they basically get on a helicopter and go to a mountaintop where a plane has crashed, and there's no you're not getting those people to a hospital for a long time. You're certainly not bringing all the hospital equipment. And you just have a skeletal staff because you can only fit so many people on it. So the nurses who do that kind of work are highly trained. This particular nurse knew how to intubate people safely, and for speaking up. And her complaint was the remdesivir, which is, we might or might not get to that. I think probably a lot of our listeners already know about the whole remdesivir thing. But she just started to refuse. She goes, I'm not hanging any more remdesivir bags because this is obviously not helping patients. It seems to be hurting them. So she was demoted on the spot. She was sent to another floor where 7 other nurses who'd been demoted were basically being put to, just cool out. They didn't have anything to do. So that was demotion, and then firing was the next step. And Mark, you had an experience with that for another reason, where security comes and walks you out of the hospital. And then some nurses, and Mark had this experience as a veteran respiratory therapist, it wasn't enough that they fired you, they blackballed you throughout the hospital system. And if you know how our hospitals work, they're not the hospitals of our grandparents. They are corporate entities. They're largely chains. They're absolutely 100% financially motivated, at least from the management point of view. I think the staff has a different attitude, but the people on top, it's all dollars and cents to them. So they have the ability to blackball. And then after they blackballed people, then they went after these nurses' licenses. And that's one of the things I talk about in the book. I don't know if you ran into this, Mark, but there was a group called Team Halo. And it was actually a project of the UN Undersecretary of Communication. We have her admitting that she was part of it, along with some drug companies that donated the money. And who else was involved in that? The Rockefeller Foundation, of course, had to be involved. And basically, what they did, and they did a joint venture with TikTok. So anybody that was a member of Team Halo got a blue check, and anything they posted was A-OK. They would never be taken down. And nominally, it was supposed to fight the spread of disinformation, but what it evolved into was a mob that went after nurses and doctors. But the book's about nurses, so I talk about nurses primarily, and harassed them, tormented them, doxed them, which means giving out their home addresses and encouraging their members of Team Halo to harass them. And that included, people showing up at the doors of some of these nurses' houses, homes, horrible pictures being mailed to them in the mail, not, so that's the iron fist. So on the one hand, we had this federal government imposed protocol. For some reason, they configured all these, or many of these ICU floors with incapable people. It may not be their fault. And when I say incapable, we're really talking about the doctors, but I found out in the last weeks of writing the book, I heard that there were inexperienced nurses, that they just had their degree but no ICU experience. Well, they had nurses on that had a degree and no practicum experience at all. Like they had whatever they had in school they had, but they didn't have their post-degree practical experience. And one of the things I talk about in the book, it's kind of a common sense thing, but you need to think about it, is you get trained in a particular department. Like, for instance, Mark is trained in respiratory therapy. He's not going to be assisting a brain surgeon in brain surgery. It's just, he could someday if he wanted to, and got the academic training and then also got the practical experience supervised for months on end. But so we had people that weren't capable. We had not enough resources. And then early intubation. Let's go back to early intubation. We talked about this on another call. What are some of the reasons that people are intubated? And obviously this isn't a seminar on intubation, but just offhand, just a couple of them, so people can get an understanding of why you would go through this intense procedure with somebody.
Yeah, so other than just your standard, like I said earlier, like a hip surgery or something, we're all probably going to end up intubated for a day or whatever, for some surgery at some point, okay. If we're lucky enough to live long enough. But other than that, I should mention too that most people think we breathe to bring in oxygen, which is not true. The drive for us to breathe from our brain is when carbon dioxide levels get high enough in our blood that stimulates your diaphragm, your respiratory muscles. So we actually breathe first and foremost to remove carbon dioxide. So that is usually why we intubate folks, is because their carbon dioxide levels are getting so high in their bloodstream. We can measure that by drawing blood from an artery, not a vein, but from a pounding artery. And we can measure the amount of carbon dioxide that is in the blood. And if you have too much carbon dioxide, your blood becomes acidic, and that's not good. And so that's kind of that's the main reason. So for whatever reason, pulmonary edema, heart failure, pneumonia, a really bad asthma attack, really bad COPD exacerbation, emphysema, something like that, you can't remove the CO2. So it'll get high levels of CO2 will make you groggy, somnolent, your mental status changes. So that's typically the main reason we're going to intubate. Carbon dioxide levels are too high. You can use a BiPAP, a mask, non-invasive ventilation. That's kind of the standard. You would go from the BiPAP to ventilation. And then you would intubate sometimes for oxygen. If somebody has a blood clot in their lung, a pulmonary embolus where they're not able to oxygenate, we would intubate to assist in oxygenation. Or again, if someone hits their head and they just don't have the drive to breathe, we'll intubate them for that. Or airway protection if someone's overdosed and throwing up, and to eliminate the possibility they'll aspirate their gastric contents. So those are your main reasons. But typically, it's going to be a high carbon dioxide level.
Gotcha. And that's something, as you pointed out, is measurable. And I imagine there's some kind of standard. If the oxygen saturation gets too high, then you sort of an indication, gee, maybe we have to intubate this person. And it's possible, based on everything that I've learned so far and the nurses I've talked to, that step might have been skipped for some patients. They might have gone straight to intubation. Which
Mark, in fact, that whole early intubation thing, they were intubating way before historically they would ever intubate. I know from where I was at, and I didn't see a lot of this at the beginning because we had a couple respiratory therapists that were fighters. It wasn't just me. We had a few that were pushing back, like, no way you're not doing this to our patients. But they were intubating patients, and I know this was the case around the country. I'm sure they were doing this in New York when a patient started to need 3 liters of oxygen in a nasal cannula. So everyone's seen maybe the elderly lady in the grocery store carrying an oxygen container, and they got what's called a nasal cannula in their nose. So that elderly lady's probably wearing 1, 2, 3 liters of oxygen. I mean, it's what we call a whiff. It's hardly anything. You could take that oxygen off them and they're going to be okay. They're not going to die. They're not going to flop. They're going to get tired. They might get a little confused. But at that 3 levels, that was the criteria that needed to be met to intubate. And there was so much more you could do to escalate. You could turn that up to 6 liters. Then you could switch to a mask and go all the way to 15 liters. Then you could go to a high flow oxygen system, which just provides all kinds of high flow, 100% oxygen. Then you could go to CPAP with a mask. Then you could go to BiPAP. That was all skipped. 3 liters, intubate. Now, I can assure you that thousands of people died that would not have died otherwise. Because I saw people that went to 6 liters, to 15 liters, to a high flow nasal cannula for 2 weeks, and then walked out of the hospital. So how many of those people that were intubated at 3 liters would have escalated, not been intubated, and went home, but since they got intubated, died? Because that was just a recipe for death. Once you intubated, that cascade of bacterial infections that would grow because of the tube, because of the medications, the blood pressure, that to me was probably the, aside from not allowing, off-label use of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, the early intubation thing is just hideous.
Mark, I had a quick question, Mark. Sorry to interrupt, Ken, just really quick.
Oh, please, Nicole. Yeah.
How much do you think impacted the bad outcomes, the policy of stay home until you're really, really sick? I mean, we've never done that where we say, hey, unless you feel like you're dying, please don't get any help from a doctor. I mean, usually we're like, hey, if you're not feeling well, if you have maybe a case of pneumonia, go in, get some antibiotics. Let's see how you're doing. I mean, we let people get really, really bad, right, before they came in. So how did that impact what you guys had to do?
It just, it just made it, because then these people would come in and already need really high levels of oxygen. They'd come in and just like almost fall on the floor, and they would require 15 liters mask, and then quickly they would need a BiPAP if hospitals were even allowing that, because BiPAPs aerosolize, and so you're spreading the virus in the room, which is a negative pressure room, and it was all nonsense. But to not try ivermectin, and we'll never know how many people would have been saved, but we know from the studies that thousands, maybe millions, would have been saved. So it was just a catastrophe. I mean, literally, they were telling people, come back when your lips turn blue. That's too late. That's way too late. They weren't even given steroids, any anti-inflammatories, nothing. Just go home, come back when you can't breathe, your lips are blue. That is just a crime. And what really blows my mind is, I had worked at this hospital for 10 years, and I still to this day think the doctors are decent human beings. Like, I don't think they wanted to kill people. I don't think they didn't take pleasure in seeing people die. I just don't understand how they could let this happen. I'll never understand that, how they couldn't just try the ivermectin. They just followed orders. They just they checked the box. Remdesivir, ventilate. They weren't thinking. I don't get it.
This, by the way, what Mark's expressing was the sentiment of all the nurses that we interviewed in the book. They couldn't believe their eyes. And to answer why the doctors would do this, and I've done a number of interviews, and sometimes people ask questions or make observations that are really helpful. And one of the things someone said to me was, "Boy, it's scary to think that you can't trust your doctor." And I said, "Well, technically speaking, that's not your doctor. That's the hospital's doctor. He or she's probably getting a paycheck from the hospital. And I hate to say it, all other things being equal, they're going to go with the orders they're getting before they're going to go with risking their salary. And as I pointed out early, it's not just a matter of being demoted or fired. You might even be blackballed, and they might even have one of these vigilante troll farms attack you as well. I mean, you just don't know how far it will go. So that's the one issue. And then the second issue is I just, not accidentally, but just spontaneously said these hospital corporations, and the interviewer said, "Oh, that's really interesting. Most people just say hospitals." And I said, "Oh, well, that is interesting, because we really need to understand these are not the hospitals of our grandparents. Hospitals were formed originally, they were charitable organizations, they were community based. Some captain of industry, would make a lot of money, and he'd, solicit all his rich friends in town, and they'd build the hospital, and it would be run on a nonprofit basis. Those days are long gone. They're still getting the nonprofit status, but they're run by corporations that are every bit as ruthless as the pharmaceutical industry. And maybe that's another thing we need to explain. I asked every nurse this question. I'm not sure if I asked Mark this one for the purpose of the book, but who runs the hospital at the end of the day? Who rules the roost, and whose word is gold? And every nurse said, "Oh, it's the hospital administrator, not the chief of medicine, not the chief of the department, not the supervising physician, not the attending nurse. It's ultimately the hospital administration." I had a confirmation of this. I have a friend and colleague right in my area here, and his father-in-law died, and he somehow got a meeting with the doctor and with the hospital lawyers. This is really interesting. It's the only time I ever heard of this. I'm sure it happened other times. And this is while the father-in-law was still in the hospital. And he turned to the doctors and said, "So in other words, you're not running this case. The lawyers are making the decision. Is that correct?" And they said, "Yeah, that's about the size of it." So this is all in a way of explaining how an otherwise good, competent doctor would go along with this. It's an environment that's very coercive, very punitive. So that's not a justification, but it's an explanation of how this kind of thing could happen. And it raises the issue that I raised earlier, which is we haven't changed a thing in these hospitals. The masks are off. The kids are back in school. The stores and churches are open. Swimming pools are open in the summer. Most people have figured out that these vaccines are sketchy at best, but the hospitals haven't changed one whit.
I think they did stop the early intubation protocols. They're still using remdesivir, but as far as I know, they are not. Maybe there are some hospitals out there doing it, but around here in the Twin Cities metro area, I don't know of any that are still doing early intubation. They might still rush to intubation sooner than they would otherwise, but not like they were at the beginning. So at least that.
Gotcha. But remdesivir is still the drug of choice. And for people that don't know the history of remdesivir, it was a drug developed to treat Ebola, to stop replication of genetic material, and somehow that was going to stop Ebola. Well, it didn't stop Ebola, but what they did have was a lot of cases of massive organ failure, which in the news media they attributed to Ebola. But when you actually read the adverse reactions sheet that comes with remdesivir, it says can cause organ failure. So this was a drug that failed in Ebola use. It had a rapid trial. I did the research on it. The trial was only 6 weeks long, and very early on, and we have the video on our website, whatthenursessaw.com. We have video of Fauci just flat out saying in April, it's remdesivir. It's going to be remdesivir. We don't see that changing. Well, what a ridiculous position to take at the beginning of a pandemic for a supposedly new and never before seen disease. And let's talk about that. The disease might have had some unique characteristics, but inflammation is inflammation. Respiratory distress is respiratory distress. So it may be a little bit different. But you mentioned ivermectin wasn't used, and vitamin D wasn't used, and zinc wasn't used, and C. But they even banned ibuprofen and steroids. What kind of steroids? Like, for instance, steroids are often given to people that are coming in with respiratory problems and inflammation.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the standard. I mean, Solu-Medrol, dexamethasone, prednisone, those are your standard systemic steroids, which are supposed to decrease inflammation. They have pretty nasty side effects, but not lethal side effects. They can mess with your blood sugar, have some other issues, blood pressure in some cases. But where I was at, they were using low dose, but I know early on they weren't. And there was like this hemming and hawing of whether or not they should. It was weird because I don't think the powers that be had decided yet on that. But yeah, COVID is an inflammatory disease, primarily an inflammatory disease of the lungs. So you would want to give an anti-inflammatory, a strong one, a steroid. When I should mention too, when it comes, so where I was working for about 1 week, in fact, I'm writing a Substack on this now, my kind of inside story. They were using hydroxychloroquine at my hospital for about a week. We had no adverse side effects, positive outcomes. And then all of a sudden, I come to work and they're like, no, we're not using it anymore. And I went into the doctor's lounge area and I asked, why aren't we using this anymore? Well, a study came out of the Lancet. It's toxic, causing cardiac side effects. And I was like, but you saw that study was bunk, right? That they retracted it, that it means nothing. But they just stuck with that narrative. They refused to go with the retraction side of it. They weren't going to listen to me because it was on the news. Who am I? Even when you lay the study, the proof in front of them, it was like they would go deer in the headlights. It's to me, it blows my mind how it's treason of the experts. I remember walking into that same doctor's lounge and saying, this virus is strange, isn't it weird? It came from Wuhan. There's a level 4 biolab there. Doesn't this seem like it's a lab-borne virus? And they're like, no, it's a wild virus. The science is settled, and what does it matter anyway? That blew my mind. What does it matter anyway? It's not so much that they wouldn't debate where it came from, but what does it matter anyway? And what was even more telling about that is I had heard that same response, that same message on the TV a couple days before. So that just told me they were just getting their sound bites from the TV. It's like your doctoring is coming from CNN.
But yeah, this is similar
to natural curiosity, right? I mean, the thing is, where's your curiosity? I mean, every human is curious. Where's your curiosity? And in Minnesota, right?
We're dealing with the most, disruptive event possibly in human history, maybe. I'm sure the Native American Indians would argue with that. But, everyone in the world was affected by this. Millions and millions of people died. Our liberties were taken away. This is maybe one of the most disruptive events in human history, and they don't care where it came from. Get your head out of your ass and start thinking for yourself. It still makes me angry thinking of this. And these were decent people. I don't know what hijacked their brains.
And if you remember, Mark, in Minnesota, Ken, you don't know this, but our governor actually, with an executive order, made it illegal for any pharmacist to issue hydroxychloroquine or any kind of chloroquine for COVID because it was not FDA approved for COVID. So he now made it illegal for the pharmacist to dispense it, even though any doctor can prescribe, as you know, any FDA approved drug for any off-label use. And our governor made it illegal. So talk about your bureaucrats saying you can't do it.
I know in our state, I don't know how it works. I'm starting to get a weird echo. Anybody else getting that?
Mine sounds good.
How about you, Nicole?
Bit of feedback from you.
It just started. I just started getting feedback.
I'm hearing it as well, Ken. So I'm wondering, let's do a quick test here. I think it might be your microphone, but maybe not, though. Let me just quickly mute your microphone, Ken, and see if it continues to happen here. Let's just really quick. Okay, check 1 2, check 1 2. Yeah, so I'm still hearing this. So it's definitely not Ken's microphone. Mark's got headphones in. Let's see. Nicole, let's temporarily mute you and see if that happens. Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Check 1 2. That's weird. I'm still hearing it. Yeah. Maybe it's my mic. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna mute myself and continue on the conversation here, guys.
It wasn't you, David, because before you muted yourself, you were clear, but now I'm hearing myself echoing.
All right. Okay, so in New York State, we had Andrew Cuomo with his daily briefings wearing his bomber jacket, pretending that he was, Field Marshal Goering or something. And, this is a guy with a political science degree and a law degree, and now he's suddenly a medical expert guiding the fate of the state. But his public health director, I wish I had his name at the tip of my tongue. He was a pediatric cardiac surgeon. So he's an MD, and he had a specialty, but his specialty was not respiratory diseases. His specialty was not public health. His specialty was not ICU. His specialty was cardiac surgery. Okay. But if you looked at his bio, he spent very little time actually practicing medicine. He spent 90% of his time working for the Council on Foreign Relations and all other kind of kooky, NGO, I'm going to call them New World Order, political organizations. And then somehow he gets attached to the hip of Andrew Cuomo, and he becomes, I guess, the ventriloquist for Andrew Cuomo, spewing out all kinds of nonsense. But, the point that the doctors were getting their training from CNN, Anderson Cooper. I like to call him Anderson Cooper Vanderbilt because he is a member of the Vanderbilt family. Two-time summer intern at the CIA, literally. You can't make this stuff up. When he was a kid, imagine getting your medical advice from that idiot. But that'll be one of the mysteries of the age. However, if we look at history, and this seems like a harsh comparison, but when you look at the particulars, it's not so harsh. We saw something similar during the Nazi regime in Germany. Every one of those prison camps and work camps and slave labor camps and extermination camps had doctors and nurses on staff. And there were 20,000 of them. Now, they weren't all extermination camps. A lot of them were slave labor camps and holding camps. But still, that's 20,000. That's a lot of places. And every one of them had a medical clinic. And so, if you imagine the most bare bones medical clinic, one doctor, one nurse, well, that's 40,000 people. And what were they doing? Well, if somebody got sick, they try to patch them together and get them back to work. And if it didn't look like they were ever going to get better or weren't going to get better soon, they would give them a lethal injection and then falsify the cause of death on the death certificate. They would attribute it to typhus. So this, at least 40,000 people were involved in this in Germany. But you can see from the way I did my numbers, it could easily have been 100. Now, when they had the doctor's trial, the Nuremberg doctor's trial, I think they only had 28 people on trial, and one nurse and 27 doctors. So they clearly didn't go after everybody. It's interesting, and this is maybe where we're going to catch some of this, is the government's funny. I'm trying to think of a ghastly crime that I can say on a mixed company. You can kill grandmas, you can run over puppies, but if you lie to the government, boy, they take that really seriously. The felony charges come out and it's no quarter. Right? Well, some people might have lied on those death certificates. They might have said COVID when the person died because there was a catastrophic failure in the intubation process, which can happen. I'm sure, Mark, if somebody's not experienced and they're trying to learn intubation on the fly, what are the odds of that going well?
Not good. I mean, it's not easy to do. I've done it, and it's hard.
No, but I mean,
I did it as a student.
You do this for a living, right? I mean, this is what you.
I don't intubate. It takes, usually we'll call anesthesia. So I'm assisting in the intubation.
I gotcha.
The anesthesiologist or a pulmonologist or an emergency room doctor will insert the tube. There are some hospitals where respiratory therapists do the intubations, but I'm there to assist. Once the tube's placed, I place them on the ventilator. I secure the tube, make sure it's in at the right depth. A lot goes into initiating a ventilator, and that's why I was so busy last night at work.
Well, let's put it this way.
Yeah,
you're in there seeing it being done every day, in a pinch, in a true emergency. You would realistically attempt it, but not your ideal scenario for you.
Yeah,
even
it's difficult. Like I said, I tried it as a student and I failed 3 times. And this was in a controlled situation in an OR where I had plenty of time. It's just really hard. I mean, you have to have the position of the patient. I mean, it's just difficult. My wife does it to neonatal, tiny little newborn babies, and she's great at it. I've seen her do it, and it's fascinating. But it takes a lot of experience, and you can cause some damage, and you need to know what you're doing.
Well, we had some reports in the book of people who died during the intubation process. You know, they put the feeding tube into the lungs. They abraded something. So it's quite. So you want someone that's good at this to be doing it.
Yeah, because once you decide to do it, you're sedating them. Then they're no longer breathing on their own. You're paralyzing them. Their diaphragm's no longer working. They're sedated. They don't have a respiratory drive anymore. So if you can't get that tube in very quickly, you're going to be using that bag and a mask, if you can picture that. Well, with COVID sick patients, you can't really ventilate well with one of those. So you need an expert there to get that thing in immediately.
So I wonder, in the cases where somebody did die because of that, or died of an infection not strictly related to COVID, I wonder how many, we know how many people, you know, the famous story of the guy gunshot, and he comes in and they swab him right before he dies, and then they declare that he's a COVID case. He's obviously been shot to death. He didn't die of COVID, and those people were called COVID cases. I wonder how many things that were designated a COVID case were the result just purely of the process of intubation and venting. We
even worse than that, I would say half the patients that they said died of COVID didn't die of COVID. And I'm the first one to say COVID was real. You know, we can argue about whether viruses exist or whatever. Something new was happening. There was a new set of symptoms that I had never seen, and it was nasty, and it was killing people. And some of them needed intubation. Like I mentioned to you, Ken, there was a time in this disease where that was your only chance. You were going to die without it. But what I saw is 90-year-old lady comes in with a urinary tract infection, no respiratory symptoms, no COVID symptoms, and they give this bogus PCR test that happens to come back positive, and then she dies from sepsis. Nothing to do with COVID. I'm sure she didn't even have COVID because the PCR tests were bunk. They were running them at too high. They were spinning them too high. We all know this. And so I think, you know, for every actual COVID patient I saw die at the hospital I was working at, I saw 2 or 3 others that would come in with 95-year-old with a GI bleed. They're bleeding from their tummy. They test positive for COVID. It goes down as a COVID death. They didn't die of COVID. They were going to die anyway. And so, you know, I'd say at least half the deaths that were attributed to COVID were that.
Gotcha.
You know what's shocking to me, Mark and Ken, is the continuation of that attitude or of the belief that what happened was good. You know, it's one thing to be in the situation in 2020 and say, okay, this is what we were told by the government. We were doing this. We were short-staffed and all these other things. It was an emergency. But we're in 2024, and people still will stand behind all of this, you know, stuff, the protocols, what they did, the masks. I mean, they're still standing behind it, no matter the data. That's what's shocking to me. I mean, is it that big of an ego for these people?
I still can't explain that side of it. Is so weird. I interviewed a guy on my show. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name now. He's a professor out in New York. Wrote a book called Treason to the Experts, and it was a really good explanation. I can't cite it all, but these people just think they know better. They think they're the informed ones, and they don't have to dig for research. They just believe, you know, the journal articles, you know, the publications. They don't need to research. They're smart. They're above us. So it was just this blindness that overcame much of society. It's that mass formation psychosis almost. And these are good people. I mean, I go to work, and there's good people there. I like the people I work with. So far, even the doctors. I mean, they seem like kind people, but I don't know why they don't, you know, I'd love to talk to the doctors I worked with at the hospital I was working at. I would love to talk to them now. Like, would you try ivermectin now? Like after all these people died, you're doing the same thing over and over and over and over. Every single one of them dies. You're not willing to try this ivermectin? No, it's a horse paste. What, you heard that on Rachel Maddow. You do some research. You know, I don't get it. It doesn't take much. You don't have to dig very deep to find there's plenty of evidence that ivermectin is very safe. It's not a horse paste. That, you know, it's just, it blows my mind, but they're still caught in that. So many people just don't do that, even the lightest bit of research. It doesn't take much to see, but they don't want to know at this point, I don't think either. That's part of it.
Well, and Ken, you compared it kind of to the Third Reich and the Nazi doctors and all that stuff. And I would argue this is the first time when we've had such a big event where so many people were killed, such falsehood, while there's a wealthy country that's not in poverty, where we're not economically in a horrible situation, where in Nazi Germany, you could say the situation was horrible. People were starving to death. You know, there was no hope and all these things. We were in a country of wealth and freedom and liberty, and we fell for this quicker than the Germans did. And that's what's so frightening.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't help that it was probably the biggest propaganda campaign in human history. I can't think, you know, that's one of my sideline studies. I'm a marketing person and I have been for decades. So I'm very, you know, very attuned to how people are informed and how people are persuaded and the different techniques that are used. But I've also studied the, you know, government propaganda across many different governments and across history. And I can't think of anything that comes even close to the level of propagandizing that went on. So it doesn't help when your government and every single news outlet is lying through its teeth. The ivermectin thing was particularly just appalling because Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, you know, they do all these good works in Africa, supposedly. But one of their good works over the last 10 years plus has been to ship container loads of ivermectin to Africa because it is a very effective treatment for parasites. So Bill Gates, who was welcome on any news channel anytime he wanted to say anything he wanted, did not intervene, did not say, hey, you know, ivermectin, it's actually safe because we've sent over 1 billion doses. And I'm not exaggerating when I say it's in the hundreds of millions of doses. We've sent over
4 billion
right.
have been given, and it's since 85 or whatever, whenever it came about, 4 billion doses of ivermectin have been given.
Yeah. So Bill Gates, you know, there's one individual who had to have known that what was in the news was a lie. Unlike us, unlike the three of us, he has easy access to the news media. He can just pick up the phone and be on any channel he wants. And he and Melinda sat on their hands and didn't say a word. How many people died because of that? So when we add the, you know, no anti-inflammatories, and by the way, the anti-inflammatories that Mark's talking about, these are not like speculative. These are not new science. You know, this is stuff like just like an aspirin. It's like a Band-Aid. I mean, it's not simple like a Band-Aid, but it's accepted. It's the standard of care. So when you throw out the basic standard of care, you deny the D, the C, the zinc, the ivermectin, the hydroxychloroquine. Then you race people to intubation. There's also an intermediate step, which, by the way, was, you know, you get a positive test on somebody. And by the way, they would test somebody over and over and over again until they got a positive test. Because from their point of view, the tests were free. And if they won, they got a big payday. If you hospitalized somebody with COVID, in New York, I think it was 14,000. West Virginia, it was $500,000 per case. And it had to do with some
I think here it was, like 39,000 for an intubated COVID. I think it was like, and then it escalated. But what's worse is the remdesivir. They were given a huge bonus to give remdesivir, not just on the remdesivir either. It was like 20% of the total hospital bill or something. I still have yet to find verification of that, but I've seen it written in several places. I don't know 100% if that's true, but I do know that they were given a bonus to give that drug. And I will say for remdesivir, though it has some really bad side effects, it can stop viral replication, but it needs to be given in like the first day or two of infection. You don't give it once they're in the hospital. Once these patients are in the hospital, it's no longer the virus. The virus is done causing its autoimmune cascade. The cytokine storm is now killing. The patient's own body is attacking itself. It's no longer the virus. So at that point, there was no use for it. And so, you know, remdesivir, and it needs to be given intravenously. It's very expensive, so there really was no place for it. You can't use it at home in an outpatient situation. Whereas ivermectin, billions of doses have been given. It's on the World Health Organization's essential medications. It won a Nobel Prize for human drug. It should have been used. It should have been dished out like candy, but instead it was just. And that's why I think they allowed for remdesivir, because they knew it would fail, and they needed it to fail because then they could push this jab. But had they done ivermectin, it wouldn't have failed. They wouldn't have been able to get the jab. And, not only did they know it was going to fail, they were going to probably kill people and collect a huge payday.
Yeah, they were not only paid to give somebody a bag of remdesivir, and by bag I mean they hang the bag and it comes straight into your veins via the tube. You got an extra payment if you did a course, so multiple bags. And then we heard of patients that were given multiple courses, because each time there was a course, the cash register would ring. And this raises the issue of how did this even start? And my book, What the Nurses Saw, and I want to encourage everybody to read it. I want to encourage people to buy it as well, because when you buy it, it raises the visibility of it on Amazon, which allows other people to see it. And I was talking with the founder of Trial Site News, which is a very serious medical science website. And I was trying to explain this book to him, and he was asking me a lot of very good questions. And I don't have an answer to a lot of them, because ultimately this is not an answer book, it's a question book. What it is in-depth interviews with 8 nurses and 1 respiratory therapist, Mark, who's on with us tonight. And they're just telling us what they saw and what their experience was and how out of the ordinary it was, and how they were disciplined, punished, coerced, blackballed, attacked for questioning what was going on, because they were veterans. They'd been in hospitals for years. They knew the right way to do things, and suddenly everything was topsy-turvy. So you're not going to find all answers in this book so much as you're going to find questions. I even have a section in the very end of the book, which is where I list the unanswered questions. And the big question is, who came up with this? Who came up with this protocol? And when we see a plane flying in the air, we don't necessarily know all the details about who owns it, who's on it, where it's coming from, where it's going. But we know somebody built it, and we know it left from an airport. And we know somebody put the pilot on and put the passengers on and pointed it in a direction to another airport. So there was volition. It didn't happen by itself. That plane's not flying around by itself. These protocols didn't come from thin air. There had to have been a room full of people in Washington, D.C. saying, we're going to ban ibuprofen. We're going to ban steroids. I want to make I want to ask Mark a question about steroids. One of the things some of the nurses complained about it said, well, they were using steroids, but they were using them in such low doses, lower doses than we'd ever used before for lung inflammation. So it was almost like they were ensuring that it wasn't enough steroids to stop the inflammation. Does that ring true to you, or what do you think about that? While we're on that.
Yeah, I think that is true, and I can't explain why. I don't know what the doctors would have been thinking. And I think it comes from higher up, and I don't know who's making those decisions.
Well, I have to think it came from bureaucrats in Washington, and it had to be. It's a knowable group of people. Like, we should be able to name these people. I can't name them in the book. I mean, this would be like the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission was a multi-volume set, and that was also full of nonsense. But at least they gave the pretense of investigating it. The Challenger explosion, remember that tragedy of the spacecraft that blew up? That was a multi-million-dollar. 9/11, I mean, it was a multi-million-dollar with serious commissioners and dozens of researchers. That's what this requires, right? But I do know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it's all going to trace back to a group of people in a room with a whiteboard saying, let's see, don't let him have ibuprofen. Well, first, send him home and tell him, don't come back until you're at death's door. Number 2, no ibuprofen. Number 3, no steroids, or a steroid dose so low it won't make a difference. Number 4, start pestering them to accept remdesivir, which we know doesn't work. because as Mark pointed out, it's a technical point, but the theory is that it's going to stop the replication of the virus. It also stops the replication of a lot of other things in your body that you don't want to stop the replication of, but that's another story. But they knew it didn't work, and they knew the way they were using it, even using their crazy theory, the way they were using it ensured it wouldn't work. And then they said, so we'll give them this remdesivir, and then we'll race them to the vent. And it's not just enough to put them on a vent. We want them on the vent for 96 hours minimum, and we'll incentivize all of this. Oh, and by the way, we're going to, because this is such a big emergency, we're going to change the law of the United States and allow any doctor that can fog a mirror in any country in the world. It could be, I'm not putting these countries down, but Afghanistan, Bangladesh, wherever. Come on in. You may not be able to speak English. It's okay. You never been in ICU? Fine. We're going to put you in charge of the ICU patients. This was a recipe for death. And it was, we know it was planned out because this was what was enforced on the medical professionals. And it was enforced by locally by the hospital administrator, but they were certainly getting the word from their CFO and their CEO, who was getting the word from the federal government. We want this done this way. We will incentivize you financially if you do it. And I'm imagining they were going to punish hospitals in some way. And again, research, we need a staff of at least 20 people to get all these answers. I imagine there was also some kind of penalty, real or implied, for using ivermectin or hydroxychloroquine.
Get fired. I know a doctor right in my hospital system got fired for all of his patients did well. They all asked for it. None of them became hospitalized. It was 100% success. Fired.
Sure, but if
there
you think
was just a nurse practitioner in Minnesota that had their license revoked because they prescribed ivermectin against orders. So,
I mean, imagine that, and so that's a two-pronged thing. So there was a hospital administrator, and Mark, I don't think I ever asked you this question, but every nurse said that my instinct was right. The hospital administrator is the ultimate authority for what happens in the hospital. I mean, and if you don't agree with him, he'll kick you out the door. True, false, half true, half.
I mean, I think, like right now, I would say, like at work yesterday, the doctors I was working with, they had autonomy, I believe. But these are just, separate from COVID situation. So, to a certain degree, these doctors do have autonomy. They're trying their best to go down their protocols to do what's right for the patient. But something was different with COVID. It was like, it was just this one path.
I think you said the magic word, Mark, though. You said protocol, right? So we know that the protocols are the gold standard. So you are protected legally as a doctor if you follow the protocol. Now, the protocol might be horrible, as in this case, but you're going to be protected if you follow the protocol personally.
And you'll be punished you'll be punished if you don't. And so how about this, Mark? Under normal circumstances, the hospital administrator lets the doctors do their thing because doctors know what they're doing, so they don't intervene. But if they're getting some kind of pressure from the CFO or the CEO because they've gotten a knock on their door from a federal bureaucrat saying, look, here's the deal. Give them remdesivir, call them COVID patients, give them remdesivir, intubate them, and you're going to make, boku bucks. So the CFO hears that, and now he's calling in the hospital administrator. I'm just trying to visualize what happened. And he's telling the hospital.
That might be right to a certain degree. I think now that I hadn't really thought that deeply about it, but I think it's more of the hierarchy of who, doctors are led by doctors higher up, which are led by, the medical director, which kind of answers to like the CDC, FDA, and the state medical board. And I think they're probably driven on a financial side to a certain degree by hospital administration, like, hey, we are getting this $39K for intubated patients, so intubate early. You're gonna intubate anyway, might as well just get them in. I don't know. God forbid that was really happening. I'd like to think better of people, but I'm sure it was happening.
The phrase being used, and you used a variation of it, but the one the nurses said a lot was, the other nurses and doctors were saying, well, they're going to die anyway. So what does it matter?
Right.
And somehow that meme got transmitted to everybody, and they just threw out, because remember, that's how it was presented to us. Oh, if you get this thing, you're a goner. There's no hope. There's no cure. You're going to die. So it might have been a team. It might have been the hospital administrator on this side and the medical director. The hospital administrator is getting the word from the CFO, and the medical director is getting the word from the CDC. And then the news media is the third element, broadcasting nonsense all day long. It was quite a thick soup. It was quite a thick soup. And again, I have to think it originated in a room with a bunch of people, because they must have, because we got to incentivize it to get the medical, to get the CFO and the hospital administrator on board. Then we have to have the CDC act as if this is perfectly sane. And then we have to be pounding them from the news media 24/7. So if I were an evil person and I wanted to do this, this is the kind of structure that I would set up. And it
would have taken time to do that. You can't do that in December of 2019 and have it all lockstep by February. That's what a lot of these rules, these laws, this protocol was put into play many, many years ago. HIPAA plays into this, the CARES Act, the PrEP Act. After 9/11, there were some laws instituted that kind of led towards this. That's why call me crazy, but I think this whole damn thing was orchestrated, and they had this whole, protocol in place. It was, how could you have it lockstep all around the entire world that quickly?
Well, when you think of another complex operation like warfare, right? There's no such thing as a country, deciding to go to war and the next day they go to war. You just can't do it. You've got to mobilize, organize. I mean, think how complicated it is to organize a online meeting among 3 people or 4 people, right? Imagine you got to transport people all over the place. But now here is something. I wonder if you saw this, Mark, or if you heard of it. The year before COVID, a hospital in Tennessee, one of the nurses reported to me, ran an Ebola exercise where everybody had to wear, and you probably know this, but all the COVID suits were all were excess, or what do you call it, surplus Ebola suits. They made a mazillion of these suits, and they were just sitting in warehouses. And so that's where the first batch of COVID spacesuits came from. But she said her whole hospital just spent the entire day going through an Ebola drill.
All hospitals did that. Our hospital did that too. I don't remember what year, but because there were a couple cases in Texas, I think, a few years back, and so they had us kind of just try on the suits. This is what you would do, kind of run an exercise. So it was pretty standard, I think, throughout the country.
Okay. But it was sort of a mental preparation for, because if you had gone straight from never doing anything like that before, and suddenly everybody's in suits and goggles and face masks, and that might have been too much of a leap. And then of course Fauci, has spent. I have another book. This book is the second book in a trilogy, and this is the first book. And the third book's going to be about the Nuremberg Code, its history, and how it's been disregarded consistently over the last 75 years since the code was put out. But Fauci and the CDC have forever been looking for the deadly virus. They're just hoping to find one, and they're disappointed when I think they were very disappointed that Ebola didn't leap the ocean and start killing everybody. They loved that Zika virus, which was probably really pesticide poisoning. If you know anything about Brazil and rural Brazil, it's one massive soybean plantation. I mean, it's frightening how big it is. And they don't do any mitigation of spraying stuff. So yeah, you're going to have some children born with difficulty. So they attributed that to the Zika virus. And I do know that
the new virus now that kills 100%. Just in the last few days, it's a coronavirus that from a pangolin, which they've mutated, and then they put it into humanized mice that have ACE2 receptors like our human lungs do, and it killed 100% of the mice. It's like, they just keep playing with these viruses, and they just love it when they come up with this, like, 100% lethality. Like, just stop playing with the damn things. The only reason you would do that is to use it as a bioweapon. There is no other reason for it.
Agreed. When this whole thing got kicked off in 2020, I heard a talk by a guy who's been fighting all these bioweapons labs, and he said there's about 10,000 people worldwide that work full-time around the world in various countries developing biological weapons, and they call it gain of function, Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of it talked about, like, it might be worth it, like, to figure out if you could find a vaccine, though I'm against all vaccines now, but a coronavirus that might evolve in 1 or 2 steps over the course of a decade or 20 years to maybe get ahead of it. Like, this drug will work on it. We'd have defense for it. But what this SARS-CoV-2 is, like, it would take 1,000 years for a virus to evolve that far. So there's no reason that's just dangerous to humanity. There's no reason to be playing with a virus that has a virulence that is that strong. There's just it's against the law. It goes against the law.
Yeah, and even people
to do it in this country.
Yeah. And then
it's actually against international law too.
Of course, China has its own laws, and you raised
I wanted to ask you something, Ken, really quick. So I think your book is so important because a lot of people are very aware of, masks don't work, lockdowns don't work, social distancing doesn't work, the problems with the jab. But not everyone, luckily, has had a bad experience going into the hospital and being subjected to these protocols. Not everyone has. So it raises a lot of awareness in people that didn't know this was happening, that might be very educated about everything else that has failed. But one of the things I wanted to ask you, when you were part of our Zoom call with Medical Justice Minnesota and all the families were on, you asked a really important question. You said, how many of you were contacted by the hospital that your loved one was dying at 4 a.m? And almost everyone raised their hand. Now, why did you know it was 4 a.m? Tell me about this.
Because I'd heard it from 4 or 5 different people. And, I think people die at all times of the day. And what's the coincidence of everybody dying at 4 a.m? And unfortunately, we had a family member, not pre-COVID, not related to this. And that was also what happened. We got the call at this ridiculous hour. Now, I know when the cops want to knock your door down, if they're afraid of what they're going to find on the other side, they love to come at 4 a.m. because that is statistically the time people are going to be most out of it. You wake up, you don't know what's going on, and it's just uncanny how often that happens. There's a group that it's on my website, and they found 25 consistencies about people that died of COVID in the hospital. And this was one of them. Did you get a middle of the night call saying you had to come right away and, say goodbye because it was all over? That's a whole nother issue we haven't even discussed, which is, was it you, Mark? Was saying that people were told, well, you can't see anybody. This is a whole issue we haven't even, this thing is so multidimensional and multifaceted.
If you want to talk about the worst part, to me, early intubation was just horrible. That was killing. The worst part about all this is the nursing home patients who spent the last year or 2 of their lives in solitary confinement and in the hospital. I held the hands of, I think, 6 or 8 people until they took their last breath, because they couldn't have. It would be like, okay, these people were the people that were, like, say 80 years old. They were very, very sick. They didn't tolerate the mask on their face, and they were just, like, giving up. They had thrown in the towel. They weren't going to get ivermectin, high dose vitamin D. They weren't going to get hydroxy. They were tired of fighting. And so they would just, go to what's called comfort cares. And so they'd pull in the iPad, and there's crying family would be there, just desperate to see them, but they would see them over an internet interface, and then they'd turn that off, and then the patient would be like, all right, put me down. I mean, it was that bad. Like, put me down now, like a dog. And they would just keep pumping morphine in, until the patient would stop breathing. And I'd sit there and hold their hand. I'm like, I'm here with you. You know, I don't want you to be alone. And man, I went home in tears so many times. Like, you don't know what it's like. And then it gets really bad because there comes a point where you're just like, give them more morphine, because this is getting just atrocious. They're like, they're out of their heads. They're gasping. They're gurgling. They're kicking. They're dying, and they're gonna die. And there comes a point where it's just like, just give them that lethal dose. It's euthanize. It's you know, I hate to say it, but it's like you euthanize them. I mean, that to me was the worst part of it all. The worst. I'm trying to remember
if it was you or someone else who said they were told, well, look, if you are willing to go die, if you're willing to die and take the, I mean, they call it comfort care. Isn't that called palliative care as well? Is that a different? Or does that mean something else?
Palliative would be more just to reduce pain. So someone on palliative care might not be that close to death, but we're going to give you plenty of narcotics, not worry too much about the side effects. Comfort care is an escalation of that. Like, you're going to die. You're terminal. We're going to make you comfortable. We're going to keep giving you morphine so that you're comfortable. It's kind of like hospice at home, but done in the hospital. And that was kind of the bargain that was done. Like, if you're ready to throw in the towel, because these patients were like, I'm not going to let you intubate me, therefore you're not going to get the big payday. So the doctors would come in and be like, well, can't see your family members, but we'll let one come in if you'll go to comfort cares. And then that would be enough for them. Like, yeah, I'm probably going to die. I want to have a loved one here, you know. So at first they wouldn't even allow that.
Okay. So their calculation was, hey, I'm really sick. They're proposing all these ghastly things. I've been fighting, and I can't fight anymore. And they're saying, if I agree to be killed, basically, I mean, we're putting maybe too fine a point on this. They're agreeing to kill them. Agreeing to be killed, we'll let one family member come in and see you.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I saw that happen. I saw it happen. Because at first they wouldn't allow anyone in early on, and then they slowly would just gradually they would, you know, bend the rules a little. All right, we'll let you have one family member in if you go to comfort cares. And then they'd, you know, as soon as that family member would come in, they'd start pulling the oxygen off and start pumping up all the morphine, and that was that.
Just, I can see it's like the clock. I'm looking at a clock. Are we really down to our last 3 minutes?
Yeah, I'm over time here, but I'm enjoying the conversation. I got a couple more minutes, so it's about perfect.
Let's
I
talk
think
about.
We're fine, Ken. I think we're
Oh,
fine.
okay, good. Let's talk about something that people can do, because we've done a pretty good job of painting what can go wrong, and we've actually just been talking just recently, just last few seconds, about the danger of being in a hospital with no one looking after you besides the staff. Now, they have something called a patient advocate at the hospital, but again, it's not your patient advocate, it's the hospital's employee. Are they going to risk their job, career, pension, and ability to work at other hospitals by sticking their neck out for you? Maybe, but statistically, we know not. By the way, I mean, we have to face the fact that people like Mark and the nurses that I interviewed are rare. So rare, I asked one of the nurses, it was less than 10% of the nurses that spoke up, right? And she said, oh yeah, way less than 10. And, you know, we've discussed a lot of gruesome, grim things here. I don't even want to know how less than 10% it was, because that's a really frightening thought. 1%. 1%.
There's, you know, there's a lot of good people in there. And if anyone that where I work right now happens to ever watch this, good people. I think they all mean well, and they want a paycheck, and they just didn't know what to do when they were just watching CNN. You know, it's kind of almost hard to blame some people. They just fell for the propaganda. You know, we've been propagandized. We're prone to. We're propagandized to a certain degree. We need to be careful on the right too to believe everything that's fed us. You know, so television programming. It's right in the word. People have been born into this, and the government has just, you know, in school indoctrination has led to this. And there's good people, really good people that just don't know what's going on.
But the bottom line is, your odds are 1 out of 100 that you're going to have a nurse or a doctor who's going to go to bat for you if the prevailing wisdom is saying, give them remdesivir, vent them, intubate them. It's not a large number. So here's the positive thing that people need to know. Number one, you need an advocate. If you're dealing with the medical system at any kind of a serious level, you need to think about getting an advocate. And that's something that I learned after writing the book and talking with some of the families and thinking about this. There are companies that do this. We've listed some. There aren't a lot of them yet, but this, I think, is going to be a growing profession. If, for example, if you have a legal problem, to get a lawyer, right? If you have some kind of a serious legal situation, you're not going to try to wing it yourself from internet posts, right? Same thing with an engineering problem, let's say in your house. If you have a foundation problem, I mean, maybe if you're a super fix-it person, you'll jack up your own house and fix the foundation, but probably you're going to hire somebody that does that for a living, right? So there are a lot of elements in modern society where we have to hire someone for help. So there is a new, growing, and I think very needed profession called nurse advocacy, where you hire a company and you have a nurse who's knowledgeable, who knows how to talk with the doctors, talk with the nurses, talk with the hospital, knows what's right, knows what's wrong. And here's the key. They're not getting a paycheck from the hospital. You are hiring them. So they're going to fight. And they may save your life. And some of these companies can also get involved at a legal level if things don't go well, and you need to use legal force. And we know there were people that had to go to court for the right to get ivermectin and save their lives. So on the one hand, we have to be aware of what's going on. If we have opportunities to fight it, we should. And that's why I love being on these programs with Mask Off Minnesota. Because you're one of the great fighting groups in the whole country. I mean, you're localized, which is the way to fight this. We do need national policy, obviously, but we need, we live locally. We don't live nationally. So you need to support. If you want you and your family to survive things like this, you need to support groups like Mask Off Minnesota. And you need to probably look into the advocacy companies that are out there and what they do and what they can do for you. If you've lost a loved one and you were told that they died of COVID, there are things you can do too. There's the group Medical Justice Minnesota, and then again, very local, true grassroots, authentic grassroots. And the first step there, before you contact an attorney, is to request your hospital records for your loved one. The reason I say before you contact the attorney, if you're involved with an attorney, they're going to charge you 50 cents to $1 per page for your medical records. And the hospital records for your loved one could be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 pages. So I believe in Minnesota, the hospitals are required to give them to you for free. But once a lawyer's involved, then they're going to charge you through the nose for them. And then once those hospital records are in hand, then you can have them reviewed by someone whose job it is, who's an expert on reading these things, and they will be able to determine if there's anything untoward that happened. There's this, I'm going to call it a myth, I hope it's a myth, that everything that happened during COVID is 100% immunity. And I think if somebody followed the protocols exactly, maybe that's true. But we've from the nurses and from the families that I've talked to through Medical Justice Minnesota, there are a ton of things that happened in the hospitals that weren't on anybody's protocol. For instance, there was one patient in 12 days, they had him on 51 different drugs. What protocol was that? And then Mark, you and I talked about this, which I think is very important. I want to make sure Andy at Medical Justice knows. You don't just put somebody on a vent. You can do it, but you better be able to show something in the chart that gave a reason for that, right? Like you don't do open heart surgery on somebody just because you have a hunch they could use it, right? You have to, right? There's some kind of, you have to note it in the chart, gave the blood, right? And get blood test, a high.
Except for unless they've got indemnity because of the whole, it's okay to early intubate thing, I think the best thing that comes of this is public awareness. Maybe, like, Scott Schara has this case in Wisconsin. That's a whole different deal there. I mean, you know, Grace was murdered. Not that the other patients were. I don't want to make light of any of the other patients that had loved ones die in the hospital, but the Grace case is a whole different ballgame. If we can get public awareness out of this, if we can let the public know that bad things were happening in the hospital, and these doctors have to start thinking twice about, hey, the public knows we did this and we know we were wrong, that's a win, even if they don't go to jail. You know, I think the best chance at legal ramifications is probably some sort of RICO case where it goes after hospital administration, medical boards, all the way up through the FDA, CDC. If you could organize some kind of case like that, maybe then you could get it done. But I'm not going to hold my breath, but I still think it's 100% worth moving forward with these cases.
Well, yeah, if the public's aware that hospitalization is not a risk-free thing, if they know that advocacy is essential, they've got to be on it. You know, they've got to be paying attention. If they're in over their head, they should really consider hiring help. And then if the doctors know, I love this analogy from football. If you're a wide receiver, hearing footsteps behind you, you know, you're going to catch the ball, but the defensive end is coming after you, and it rattles you. You pay a lot more attention than if you don't hear the footsteps. So if we can make sure all doctors and nurses, I'm sorry to say, because they're not all angels, believe me. Yeah. Some are, the ones in the book are, but we want them to hear footsteps behind them, so they think twice before going down these strange pathways where, oh, they're all going to die anyway, so what does it matter? That should never come out of the lips of a doctor or a nurse.
No.
And don't ever go to the hospital alone.
And don't go to the hospital alone.
Ever. Not even with a little broken pinky finger.
They do that again.
No, don't go to the hospital
do that
alone.
Again. That's where the public needs to step up this time. Everyone, it's us against them. There's no picking sides. There's no right or left. There's no Republican or Democrat. No, you are allowed a patient advocate. Somebody you love needs to be there. That was unbelievable that they allowed that to happen.
And so if you have a loved one that's going to the hospital and you think it's too simple to bother with, nothing, once they're through those doors, all kinds of stuff can happen, and some of it's not good. To use a football analogy again, it's like the receiver could catch the pass, or he could drop it, or it could be intercepted. So a lot of things can happen in a hospital, and some of them are not good. Now, one little thing that I was told, very interesting. So let's say somebody is they're having trouble breathing, so they're agitated, or they're put on a BiPAP, and the BiPAP's super uncomfortable, and nobody's really prepared them psychologically for how uncomfortable it would be, and they get agitated. Well, now the intervention could be a drug intervention, and it could be as innocuous as, would you like to have something to help you relax? And my understanding is once you say yes, you're now in kind of a new legal territory. You're somebody that has a psychiatric disorder that required medication, right? You know, they didn't present it to you that way. When they didn't say, well, you're a psychiatric case, and we're not going to intervene with it. But once you've done that, you are now somebody who is of potential danger to yourself and others, which means they can hold you for as long as they want to hold you. You can't just get up and walk out. So be careful about, you know, if you need a sedative, you know, or painkiller, you know, I'm not saying don't take one, but don't take it lightly, and realize the consequences legally of taking one. All the more reason to have a loved one with you, or a friend, or and this is a service you could do for somebody, a community member. Churches really should probably, you know, any kind of a group of people that care about each other should probably have a hotline. Hey, you know, Mrs. Jones, who's a widow, you know, she's going to the hospital. Who can go and be there to just overlook things? This is important. So, yeah.
And from a practical perspective, you want someone else to hear what the nurse and the doctor is saying. The patient is stressed out, even if it's just a simple thing. You're stressed out. You're not hearing things. You know, you have 4 ears hear it. Different things are going to be heard. You know, you're watching, you're asking good questions. I mean, it's very practical to have another person there. As a patient, you should not be focusing on these things. You should be focusing on getting better. You know, and they make you sign all kinds of things at the hospital. One of the first things they make you sign is all the consent to treatment forms, the financial forms. I mean, you have no idea. You need someone there just to be your eyes and ears. That's it.
Yeah, you're the least likely person to be able to handle that, and if you have a really serious problem, you're absolutely not able to handle it.
Yes. Well, this has been phenomenal. Everybody needs to buy Ken's book. I mean, it's phenomenal. And not just buy Ken's book, buy a book of Ken's for your neighbor or your loved one. Ken made a great point when you were writing the Real Anthony Fauci book. Do you remember, Ken? You said people don't throw books away.
Right.
So if you have a neighbor or a family member that, needs to be maybe a little bit educated, or you feel like this might make a difference in how they view things, buy that book, put it in their mailbox, drop it off at their home. Give them a different perspective. I think it'd be super helpful and raise awareness. Let's do it. I mean, it's not that expensive. It's a great gift. So.
Yeah, Nielsen, you can't hand somebody a website and you can't hand somebody a webinar, but you can hand them a book. And don't forget your public libraries. That would be a great thing. And we made an effort to make it look like a good book. It looks good. It's substantial. Yeah, that would be a big help. And when you buy the book, not only do you have it for yourself, you're also raising the profile of it on Amazon. And if we can stay in the top rankings for certain categories, that creates even more sales. So that's a form of activism. Of course, it's self-serving for me, but believe me, not making money on these books. Almost anything else.
Yeah, that's the
do.
point I wanted to make. Everyone should applaud Ken because he's not doing this for money. That's everyone needs to be well aware for that. Ken's doing this for all the right reasons and giving away the book. We just want the message.
Well, and just so you know, Ken, you gave away a digital copy, and one of our members read it from between last meeting and this meeting, and she actually sent me a text message. Her husband was denied a test because he couldn't wear a mask, and they wouldn't accept his mask exemption. And she said, in retrospect, I'm so glad he didn't get this exam done, because who knows if he would have tested positive, and then, all this stuff would have happened. I would have been excluded. So she made the point of, reading that book made her feel good about, hey, he missed this exam, but thank God, because who knows what would have happened,
Yeah, and simple things like second opinions. No matter what a doctor tells you, go hear it from another doctor, because sometimes they see completely different things.
Yep.
How about avoid going to the hospital? Get your meds on hand. Get yourself some ivermectin, some hydroxy. Take the vitamin D. Eat well. Avoid toxins. Do not rely on that broken sick care system. Do something else. I'll go there if I break my leg or if I have crushing chest pain. I'm done with that system. No more annual checkups. All they want to do is give you drugs. They are drug pushers. It's the white coat cult.
Yeah. I mean, I'm old enough to know that there was a time where they didn't give drugs to everybody for everything, and multiple drugs. Like, they never drugged kids for any reason. I mean, all these mood modifiers and hyperactivity modifiers. I mean, they didn't exist until the 1980s, 1990s, and we got along fine.
They were able to patent a molecule, and they had to find something. Let's label. Oh, that 8-year-old boy can't sit still.
Right.
He needs drugs. I couldn't sit still. I mean, I would have been drugged, I'm sure, if they'd had it available.
Oh my God, yeah, yeah. So we lived.
Do we have any questions, David, that came in for Ken? Any in the chat box that we should ask?
Yeah, I just want to throw that out there that, folks, if you have any questions for Ken, go ahead and type into the chat box there. We had a couple come in that were just kind of technical questions, so I've already answered those in the chat box. I want to throw out just a quick plug to Mark and his Truth Expedition podcast. Ken and myself have been on it several times, so quick plug to Mark's Truth Expedition podcast. Look that up on Rumble. And yeah, so if you folks do have any questions, go ahead and use the chat box. Actually, I think it's labeled questions on the interface there, and let us know what kind of questions you have. And then, by the way, on the screen right now, if you haven't claimed your free digital copy, go to maskoffmn.org/Ken's book. Also in the chat box is the purchase links, as we just alluded to a few moments ago. Please do, even though you're getting it for free, please do also purchase it. A copy for yourself, a copy for a friend, and please share the love by giving it to someone. And it's one of those things where, if you give someone a tangible book like that, they can't just really ignore it. It's like if you give them, like Ken said, a webinar or a video, it's just it's digital. So if you have a physical book, what a nice gift. You're thinking about them, and it's a tangible thing that they're not just going to toss that away. They're not going to delete the physical book.
Great
so let's see if we
coffee
have any
table book
questions.
because it's the kind you could just open up at any page, literally. You could just open it to any page and start reading. You'd just be like, what? You know, just anywhere in there. You could start at any chapter, any page, literally.
Yeah, the people I interviewed were really very, very everyone is an extraordinary person. All different backgrounds, but it's a great group of people. So you'll get to meet some really remarkable people that will give you some hope in humanity, hope for humanity.
So we did have a couple quick questions that came in here. So one I'll just answer really quickly. Mary's asking, has this been recorded? And she would like to share it. So yes, Mary, we'll be sending this out to our Mask Off email list. So as long as you're on the email list, which you should be if you're on our call tonight, you'll be getting a copy of this. Will be uploaded to our Rumble channel here in the next few days. And of course, you can share it like crazy from there, as you can, just like you can share our last couple meetings that we've had here. You can share all from our Rumble channel. Now, Shalom is wondering, how can we contact Ken? Ken, is there a good place for people to reach out to you?
Well, it depends on what you want to contact me for.
Fair enough.
Because I mean, I can't. I have a lot of people contacting me about specific things, and my days are pretty full.
We'll see if we can get a follow-up from Shalom there, and maybe she can clarify what kind of context there.
I like to be as helpful as I can, but if it's an area I can't be helpful in, I'd rather not try. If I already know in advance, it's not something I can do. So just so people know, I'm an advocate, obviously, of Mask Off Minnesota. I'm a big advocate of Medical Justice Minnesota. If you're in Minnesota, these are the groups I would recommend that you be contacting. First is becoming a member, which I guess you already are. Medical Justice will be able to advise people who've either been injured by the hospitals, because not everybody was killed by these protocols. Some people did manage to survive them. They're facing long-term health consequences as a result. But you can contact Medical Justice Minnesota if you think a loved one may have been killed or injured. And they didn't die of COVID, but they died of the protocols or other things like neglect, like abuse, like garden variety malpractice. They can help you with those specifics. That's not something I can help with in particular. And as I mentioned, I'm working on the next book, which is called the Nuremberg Code and its Modern Enemies. And it's about what the Nuremberg Code is, because everybody's talking about the Nuremberg Code, but I haven't met hardly many people that have read it. And I want to talk about why we even have one, what it says, and who has been steadily working to erode it since it came out 75 years ago. You may not be surprised to know that one of the people active in that is Anthony Fauci's wife, who's the head of bioethics for NIH. And she wrote a book on something about the AIDS vaccine, and that she wrote many years ago. But the thrust of that book was we really have to change our experimental ethics so that we can put these vaccines out quicker, because the need is so urgent.
It's amazing how they can spin it like that. So we do have a bunch of questions that have come in actually in just the last few minutes.
Okay, great.
So Melanie's wondering, what records specifically do we need to make sure we ask for from the hospital? I have my dad's, but I don't think I have everything.
Okay. Here's what I understand, and maybe Mark can help, and definitely Medical Justice can help. As soon as you check in, the one thing they do well, and by the way, the Nazis did this too, and it's why some of the Nazi doctors got caught. They're really into record keeping and stacking up paper. So there should be, from the minute that person checked in till the time they came out, there should be a stack of papers describing every test, every procedure, every observation, everything, right? Is that how it works, Mark? They just keep writing stuff in?
These hospitals, I would say you want it all, because you never
you want it all,
where,
sure.
Yeah, you want to try to get it all there, and you have a right to it. Of course, they might try to withhold some of it, and you never know what's being withheld. But yeah, I mean, we are my boss is on me. You chart, I have to chart everything that I do. If I turn a dial on that ventilator, I have to chart exactly what time, why I did it. I I put a note in. So there's a flow sheet with I changed the respiratory rate to 14 at this time. And then there's a note, I changed the respiratory rate for this reason because of this blood gas. And I reference the lab work and the x-ray or whatever. You know, it is like, it's meticulous. It's all there. You want it all because you never know what part of that was negligent.
And if you're
And the reason that you chart this way isn't just because of safety and security, but it's billing. I mean, you have to chart everything because everything you do is coded, and everything that's coded is charged.
Yeah, definitely. And they're really honest to make sure we get those charged, you know, in the flow sheet. But you know, really, I want to give the benefit of the, you know, like my bosses, they want it to be thorough. I truly believe that. They want everything in there. How did the patient sound after your treatment? Make sure you chart that so that the next therapist knows. You know, so there's some good in it.
Absolutely.
And you know, and we can utilize that.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
I think it's fantastic that they make a note because, you know, for learning, theoretically, you could, you know, all this stuff could be just, you know, put into a database and you could see, well, you know, it looks like every time we did this under these circumstances, it didn't go too well. Maybe we better, you know, rethink doing that, or wow, we did this and it always seemed to work. Let's do more of it, you know. And which leads us to this is, and we'll answer the questions too. Medicine is my understanding is it's really an art. Now it's supported by science, but it's an art in the sense that every patient is different. They're all, you know, there's no such thing as one disease that everybody has exactly identically. It can't be because everybody's body is different. And so that's where the art comes in. I don't mean art in a wishy-washy way. I mean like a great painter or a great sculptor has to have a good set of eyes and a good set of hands and really be paying attention to what they're doing. You can't do a one-size-fits-all. If you're running a confinement, you know, chicken farm somewhere where you've got chickens in a all jammed together, well, maybe you have to run that in a one-size-fits-all. Hey, they all need the antibiotics now, right? Period. But we're not hopefully we're not being seen as chickens in a battery farm.
I think we are, Ken.
Well, that's maybe that's the first thing we need to address, you know. That's the first thing we need to address. But anyway, it is an art. So yes, there's science behind it and there's ever evolving science and all that's good, but a lot of it's art. And I don't mean that again in a wishy-washy sense. I mean somebody that knows what they're doing, has seen a lot, is paying attention, is looking, and is noticing all those subtle differences that are different in every human being. One thing one of the nurses said, which was so interesting, is, you know, when things work well, it's a team. You know, the nurse, the doctor, the phlebotomist, when Mark comes, let's say if it's a respiratory thing, there's a lot of people working on a single case. And in an ideal situation, they've all got their eyes open, they're all drawing on their experience, and they're all talking with each other. Even an orderly, you know, could be helpful and say, hey, the patient's suddenly, you know, turning blue. You know, well, that's significant, you know. So
that's why it's called the practice of medicine and not the science of medicine.
Right. Right. It's a practice. They're practicing until they get it right. No. But in fairness, you know, this is a difficult profession. Because everybody is so different and you don't know all the underlying things in a particular person, and you may find out the hard way. Someone may have a strange reaction to a drug that they didn't know they had and you didn't know they were going to have, and now they have it. Now you got to deal with it. So these guys and gals are on the cutting edge of a really impactful, serious thing. So we have to cut them slack in that they're human beings, right? So what we're not saying, oh, you know, well, doctors are terrible, nurses are terrible. That's not the point here. It's the point that the system is dictating and reinforcing and encouraging substandard conduct as opposed to the best of conduct. And you know, nobody's going to come on a white horse and save us if we don't get together and compel these hospitals or if we, to the extent we can, our government to start doing things correctly. You know, there's going to be all this pressure on the people that we are entrusting our health to. But we can't ask to have these people available to help us and then be unduly critical of them. You know, we have to understand the environment that they're working in. and all the variables and all the difficulties that they face every day. That's another thing that the nurses brought up. Sorry to go off on a tangent. This is hard work under the best of, even if you do everything right. You know, people who you didn't want to see die are going to die not because of anything you did, because of he died. You know, people die. You know, and to see death and to see people in grave distress. I mean, this, you know, there's a certain clinical frame of mind I think people develop, but it's not, you're not impervious to seeing the suffering of others. So this is a really cutting edge. You're on the front line, even under the best of circumstances. So we have to remember that. Now we have to hold the system to a high standard and demand better from the system. But we have to remember that people delivering are human beings. And most of them are trying their best, want to do their best.
And that's something else, Kim, that's really important about having a family member there. In addition to being an advocate for your family member, what I say is when you're there, you're helping your doctors and your nurses because you're watching your family member constantly. You're right next to them. You understand this is how many times they had to use the bathroom. This is the pain they felt. This is what I saw. You are being helpful. So having a family member there helps the doctors and the nurses. So look at yourself as that and do form connections to the nurses and the doctors. Have those conversations, that small talk, because we are human beings. We need to connect as human beings. But you're going to help them as a family member.
It lowers the patient's stress level too, and stress is really bad on the immune system. The number, believe it or not, I think it was the number 2, aside from obesity and diabetes, anxiety and fear-related disorders were the number 2 or 3 cause of secondary cause of death with COVID. Your body does not work. Your immune system does not function. Your cortisol levels go through the roof. The cytokines are more apt to storm. You know, so like that's how I feel in the hospital too. I can go give someone a nebulizer or something, you know, if I'm on the floor treatments, but I feel like it's more valuable to smile at them. Let them know that there's someone there that cares about them, to see if they need a warm blanket. Do you have cold water? Give them a few minutes of your time. That goes a long ways. And there's a lot of good people in the hospitals, but the family being there, that can save lives, I swear. Just that reduction in stress.
Mm-hmm. And let's point out something else related to that. I don't know how it is in Minnesota, but in New York, I looked the number up the other day, and I think we've eliminated 25%, I believe that's the percentage, of our hospital beds in the last 20 years. Now, our population hasn't gone down 25%, but the hospital corporations are trying to figure out how they can, you know, make more money and be more cost effective and everything. So they're reducing the hospital beds. Well, they're not just reducing hospital beds, they're reducing staffing. So they're putting nurses and other medical personnel through, you know, giving them more work than is reasonable for them to be able to do well. So that's another thing that we need to pay attention to because, you know, they're taxing us. They should be able to use that money for our benefit.
They're spending it on tampons in boys' bathrooms, though.
That's the thing here in Minnesota. Gun.
Right, counseling, you know, confused young people that, oh, you're really not a boy, you know, or you're really not a girl. That's your problem. I mean, yeah. Crazy.
So I want to get through a few more questions here, guys. Now,
yeah, I got just a couple minutes, David. If you got any for me, let me know. Otherwise, I'm just going to bug out.
Yeah, let Mark go. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I don't see anything that I think are specifically for you, Mark. We'd love to have your input, of course, but we understand that we're way over time with, and I know you have to get flying, Mark. So feel free to hop off here whenever you need to, Mark. But Michael and Mary just pointed out the COVID protocols didn't allow anybody into the hospital to advocate for the patient.
That's right.
So that
and
was,
you know what's amazing? Everybody, including Mark, that I interviewed said that was the worst of all the terrible things they did. That was the worst thing they did.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah,
in
absolutely
my opinion,
right.
by design. I 100% believe that was by design. And now Melanie I want to come back to Melanie. She'd asked about the hospital record.
I know you want to. Should we say goodbye?
Yeah, my kids are having a multi-child sleepover tonight. I promised I'd entertain for a while. I'm a little overtime here, but I have a lot of respect for Nicole, for David, and Ken. So it's an honor and a pleasure to be able to, lend you some of my time, and I'm sure we'll all talk soon. And everyone else out there, I can't see you. That's the bad part about this, but Anyone watching, thanks for being involved and being awake and doing your part, speaking the truth. God bless
Thanks for
everybody.
sharing,
Mark.
thanks for sharing all your
Thank you,
technical
Mark.
knowledge.
Thank you, Mark.
You bet.
Bye.
Talk to you soon, Mark. Okay,
Okay.
so I wanted to come back to what Melanie was talking about with the medical records here. She did actually add a few more details, and I wanted just to throw this out there. She said, I feel like they're not specific enough, like the details are not there. How do I know I have it all? They murdered him in 2020. So first off, I wanted to say to Melanie, if you have not reached out to Medical Justice Minnesota and Nicole at Medical Justice Minnesota, please do so ASAP. That's the links in the chat box, medicaljusticemn.org, I believe. It's in the chat box there. But Ken, do you have any follow-up on that? She's wondering, how do I know I have all the records?
So it's
chronology first, right?
What was that, Nicole?
Well, the first thing I would look at if I get medical records is I would look for a chronology, like a rough chronology. So whenever your loved one went into the hospital, whatever the date was, let's say it was January 14th, right? Look for, like, every day there needs to be multiple entries every day. So if you're missing a few days here and there, you're missing something. So then you can go back and specifically say, listen, I'm missing these days, right? And I need to get, it looks like this was missed, could be an error, could be on purpose. So look for the chronology first, and then you can look for the detail. If she already feels like the detail isn't there, I think Medical Justice MN is a good place for her to go and say, what do you think I should be doing? But there should be multiple entries every day. Every time there's a shift change, every time there's an administration of a drug or a test, there should be an entry. But look for the chronology first. That gives you a really good indication.
That's great advice.
She added, I have reached out, we've talked, to Medical Justice Minnesota. Good, Melanie. And she said that some of them don't even have dates. Some papers have info and no dates.
And I would go back and say, listen, something is not right. This is incomplete. This doesn't even have a date. I think you missed something. You need to go back. I need to get all of the records. Yeah, just keep bugging them.
And Ken actually alluded to this earlier, I think. She just wrote, I need a degree. She feels like she needs a degree to read this packet of papers.
Yeah, well, it's true. It's true, and it's not your fault. And I would need a degree. I like to think I'm halfway intelligent. I tell you right now, I couldn't deal with a stack of records like that. No way. So, medicaljusticemn.org. See what they can do. Their procedure right now is they have now. Listen, when I say they, it is a handful of citizens working without compensation and working very long hours and very hard. So you have to understand that it's not some well-funded nonprofit where the executives are making multiple six figures to do God knows what. These are people that are rolling up their sleeves and working really hard as a service to their community. So you have to understand that when you work with them. But the way this goes is you get the records, whatever records you can get. And then the next step would be like a nurse examiner. And Andy, who is the legal lead for Medical Justice Minnesota, has at least one person. I'm trying to link them up with more so they have a bigger team that they can refer to. Those analyses cost money. Obviously, somebody's got to do the work to do it. Now, right now, it seems like they're trying to do as many of them they're trying to subsidize as many of them as they can. I will say this: if you can pay for it yourself, please do, because right now there's no money, and so so the next step would have a professional who does this for a living go through the records. They'll see things right away. They'll see if something's missing. They'll see if something's too vague. They'll see if something wasn't done correctly. All these things will just pop out to them. I don't know. It's like several hours to do it. Then if it's going to go to court, or if there's a chance of it going to court in Minnesota has a slightly longer runway than other states. You have a 3-year window. You might be coming up fairly soon. I don't know. My math's not too good. 220, 24, well, it's possible. Well, I know that's something to ask them. They'll know that question. They'll know the answer to that question right away. But once a nurse has gone through it, if she's found something untoward, it then gets escalated to the level of a doctor. The doctor's just going to read the nurse's report and write a 1-page letter saying, I see enough material here based on review of these records to justify a legal claim, pursuing a legal claim. that opens the case. And you want to open, if you're going to have any chance of legal justice at all, you got to open the case ASAP. And so that's the procedure you have to go through. And then there's a 6-month window before you have to come up with a detailed complaint against the defendant, which in this case would be the hospital or any of the doctors or the nurses. So there's 6 months, and that's heavy lifting. And again, nobody's got any money. Everybody's just working, trying to make things happen. Hopefully the organization will get bigger. Hopefully their fundraising will kick in and will start working. If you know people that care about the community, that looking for things to do with their money to be helpful to the community, I would support Medical Justice, mn.org. Because I think the ideal scenario would be we get as many of these medical records as we can, and have them as many of them as evaluated as we can. And in the case where there is something that's actionable legally, get the ball rolling at least. You don't know what's going to happen in the next 6 months, but at least you don't miss the statute of limitations. And maybe if there's enough of these lawsuits, the courts are going to start to look at them and say, gee, there's a problem here. Might become a newsworthy item. I mean, if suddenly there's 50 lawsuits filed in Minnesota about questionable deaths during COVID, that might be a news item unto itself. We're really battling from the ground up here. We need every edge we can get, and an abundance of legal filings. They're not really lawsuits yet. They're just a filing at that point. Could be something that would get the powers that be to start paying attention.
Now, I do want to. Yeah, I think so. I do want to move on to some other questions. Now, she did add a few more things. I just want to quickly read. Don't maybe necessarily need to respond to it, but she did say that I've counted over 50 meds given, and I work in a warehouse. No medical background here, but one of those meds was Narcan. And she says, isn't that for overdoses? And she says, I will pay whatever cost I have them reviewed. Where do I go? My time is up for my dad. He passed too long ago. So this information is for me to know these people lied to me. So I think we've given a lot of information there. Hopefully, Melanie, that's been helpful.
Here's my thing about this line of questioning. So it's just one person asking the question. However, there may be hundreds of people who see this video who will enjoy, or not enjoy, but appreciate the level of detail we're going into. So go to medicaljustice.mn.org. Tell them that you are able and willing to pay to have a nurse analyst. There's also a company called, it's kind of a quirky name. It's on my website. There's a website for the book called What the Nurses Saw. There's a section called Resources. And in Resources, I have two companies that can do this kind of analysis work. And then Andy knows one because he works with one. And I just want to say this, you're doing it for yourself to know what the heck happened. But I also want you to know that you're doing it for everybody, because the more information, because we have no information. The government's done nothing. The news media's done nothing. The medical profession's done nothing. The academic world's done nothing. None of these groups are going to do anything for us. But we can do something for ourselves. And so every person that goes through this onerous process of getting the records and having them analyzed by a nurse examiner is creating data that benefits everybody. So you're getting, if it feels any better, you're not only helping in your own situation, you're also helping the larger cause and other people now and in the future. Any other questions related to that?
Yeah, actually, let me just bring up. So we have some other questions that aren't totally related. Like one question was, how did Ken locate the nurses in the books? I don't know if you wanted to go into that at all, Ken.
Well, two of them were on YouTube in the spring, and I remember watching their YouTubes with my jaw hitting the ground, going, "My God, this is like really important." Both nurses are saying that people are these two nurses. They were both working in the city hospitals in New York City, which I'll tell you, having visited one once, they're a nightmare under the best of circumstances, right? Because these are hospitals for people that have no resources, so they're city run, they're government run. This was supposedly where, remember they were telling us that New York was just, they had a battleship they brought to the harbor because they were going to have so many cases, and they built a field hospital for 1 million people, and then 2 people showed up, right? But in any event, they were, and also, the public hospitals are in poor neighborhoods. The poor neighborhoods have a lot of people who are immigrants that may, legitimate immigrants that may not have a big social network. So there were a lot of poor people, and maybe their families weren't around, or their families were intimidated by the hospital process, or didn't have enough English. So it was there were a lot of people that weren't not going to be missed if they were killed. And I really do think they got, the death rate, it's at some point, I did the numbers way back, and it's not, unfortunately, I didn't put them in the book, but the death rate in the New York City hospitals was, the number of people hospitalized for COVID and number of people died was off the charts. It was like some insane, just way out of proportion. And poorly run hospitals, poorly managed hospitals, doctors and nurses that were not qualified were in the ICUs, and the prevailing attitude, I'm sorry to say, was they're going to die anyway. So what difference does it make? And so these 2 nurses that were that went on YouTube very early were both nurses in those situations, and they were both super veteran nurses. One's literally a combat veteran. The other one is an air ambulance specialist, which means she's top training, right? Top experience, and also worked in a field hospital. And she said you would be better off going to a field hospital, which is just a tent, in a third world war zone, than going to one of these hospitals to be treated for COVID. You have a better chance of surviving. So I started with those 2, and then I asked them, hey, do you know anybody else? And bit by bit, oh yeah, call her, call him, call this. I met Mark through you, which was great, David. I could have interviewed a lot more. Also, every single nurse told me they knew at least 100 to 1,500 nurses. Some of them were more public and were getting a lot more emails, but every one of them said there's 100 nurses that will back me up in my story, or 200 or 500 or 1,000. And the book's pretty thick. In fact, I was just, doing interviews and editing them and sending them to my designer and having him, okay, put this one in, put this. And at a certain point, he wrote me and he said, Ken, we're coming up on 500 pages. I think we need to, bring it to a conclusion here. Otherwise, this thing's going to be, an encyclopedia. So this book could have been a lot thicker. And if you wonder what's in it, it's me asking these nurses, what did you see? What happened? And then what happened to you when you spoke out? And then what happened to you after you were fired? And because that was the 3 things: the crazy protocols, the enforcement with an iron fist, and then the after game, where they were chasing some of these nurses down and going after their licenses and setting troll mobs against them. So that's how I found the nurses.
That's great. Another question came in. I'm curious what you think here, Ken. Where do you find a patient advocate? I'm assuming that they mean if you don't have a loved one that you can bring in, because we just a few minutes ago spoke on how important that was. What do you do if you don't have a loved one you can bring in?
Let me look up. I'm going to go to my own site. It's a funny thing. I used to hear people who'd written books, and somebody would ask them a question, and they go, "Oh, it's somewhere in my book. I can't remember the exact answer." And I thought, how ridiculous is that? How could you write a book and not know what's in it? Well, I now know how that can happen, because there's a lot in the book. All right, so if you go to whatthenursessaw.com, you'll see something called, one of the menu items is resources. And under resource, there we go, top one, advocacy services patients and their families can hire to help them deal with the medical system. So this is either, while your loved one's in the hospital, or if they're, out, or they didn't survive, following up and figuring out. One of them is called Graith Care. It sounds like Grace, but it's like someone who has a lisp. Graith, Graith Care. I've heard very good things about them from every nurse that I talked to. And then there's another group that was founded by one of the nurses. I believe it's Ashley Grogg. And I could have that wrong, and please forgive me if one of the nurses is listening. I've had to meet more people in the last month since this book came out than I have met in a lifetime, I think. And the other one's called Remnant Nursing. And this is nurses who've decided that they can't possibly deal with the system anymore, and they are creating their own clinics, their own freelance services. Because here's the thing, and we've talked so negative, because the story's not pretty. In America, in the United States, nurses are very well trained. They're some of the best trained nurses in the world. And then that a nurse that has a lot of experience, 5, 10, 15, 20 years of experience, they probably have more clinical experience than any doctor. Because how long does the doctor see you? He comes by with a clipboard, he talks to you for 2 minutes, and he's gone. How long does the nurse see you when you're in a hospital? All day long. So nurses see a whole lot. So there's this weird hierarchy that, the doctors are up here. Well, first of all, the federal bureaucrats are up here. The academicians and researchers that the federal government pays off to get the results they want from their medical studies is here. Then the doctors are here, and the nurses are holding up the bottom. It really is, it should be reversed. The nurses are the ones, they can't prescribe, they can't diagnose, but they can keep you alive. And inform the doctor as to how you're doing. So your nurses are very, very, very important. So we need to support our nurses. Next time you see that the local nurses are on strike in your community, you might inquire why, and you're probably going to find out they're being asked to work insane amounts of hours under bad working conditions, which doesn't help us as patients. It doesn't help our family members. So, I'm trying to figure out ways to harness all the different forces here. And I do think the nurses, there's us, concerned citizens. Unfortunately, there's the families of victims. That's another large group of people. There are practitioners who care. And included in that, there's a whole lot of nurses that would like better working conditions, and that would help us all. And there's a lot of them. Do you know that 1 out of 86, I think it's I might have this slightly off, 1 out of 86 Americans is a nurse. I couldn't believe that number when I looked at it. But, there's only 330 million of us, right, total? Well, there's 5 million nurses. So that's that's more than 1%. So there's a lot of nurses out there, and they can and do wield power, and they're doing it over salary, which is understandable, and working conditions. But remember, we're the ones that suffer from the working conditions too. And if we could somehow empower all the nurses and get them in line with our observations and what needs to be done, and we could really be a big force. So I don't know if I answered the question. I just spun off into all kinds of.
No, I think it was great. It was great. I do have some slightly bad news. I did miss a question from Mark. I feel bad. It was a question from Mark, and it's actually a good one. So I'm just going to read it, even though Mark's not here to address it. But Karen said, "Hi, Mark. Can I ask you how you're able to work in a hospital and yet struggle, rightly so, with the whole hospital white coat cult, as you referred to tonight? I recently left a large medical institution in Rochester." We all know what that is, where I can no longer work for such a politically malaligned medical institution. I'd love to hear how you work in a setting where you struggle with the morals and ethics of that institution. Thanks for your thoughts. That came from Karen. And if you're from Minnesota, you know the very large medical institutions based in Rochester. It's internationally known. So I wanted to throw that out there from Karen.
The mayonnaise clinic?
Yes, the mayonnaise clinic. Yep, the Miracle Whip clinic. It's the Miracle Whip clinic.
Here's the dilemma that Mark feels and all these nurses felt too. It's like, well, I could leave, and then what? What's going to happen to these patients? And there were some nurses like Nurse Erin who stayed on and documented. She videotaped a lot of stuff. And I think her nurse, she's got a book, Pandemic Nurse or something. It's a book worth getting. I'm going to have to put it on my desk next time I do an interview so I can show it. I only just got it yesterday. But she stayed later. She stayed many months longer than she wanted to try to save as many patients as she could and to document as much as she could. There were nurses that even took the vaccine because that was a condition of further employment, who knew the vaccine was not only BS but dangerous, so they could stay and try to help patients. So it's a tough call. It's a tough call. But if they all leave, then we're really in trouble. Because this, again, historically, this is what happened in Nazi Germany. One of the things that the Nazis were very interested in is that for some reason they had to know everybody who was Jewish, whether they were practicing religious Jew or whatever. They just needed to know. And they, with the help of IBM, they built up this huge database of all the Jewish people in Germany. Why they did that, they weren't telling anybody, but they were very intent on doing it. A couple of years later, along comes the Nuremberg laws, in which they told Jewish people, you can't work as a doctor or a nurse anymore in this country. And who replaced them? Card-carrying Nazi party members. So it's a tough call. I mean, if your own mental and physical health is being wrecked by being in an institution like that, you got to do what you got to do. But the people that are staying, they're providing a really important buffer for us. And that's the other thing too. So important. Your nurses swear an oath to be your advocate in a medical system, in a medical setting, in a hospital setting. It's part of their professional oath. It used to be a big deal. They're trying to erode that, of course, obviously. But when the doctors are doing something wrong, or the hospital is doing something wrong, or the mistakes being made, accidental things, which happen all the time in every human endeavor, the nurse is sort of your last line of defense. So you need to know that. Okay, what else?
Couple last minute questions here, Ken. Just real quick. Manny's wondering, are there any options? Manny's a longtime Mascot Minnesota member. Are there any options besides Amazon to purchase the book? We all know it helps build the algorithm, but a lot of us, don't like Amazon that much. So is there any way that they can order directly from you, Ken?
It's just a matter of logistics. If I had to sit here and pack, if you've ever packed, I once had a job where I packed boxes, and I could only do 100 a day. And that was a full-time job. I don't have time to pack boxes and ship them for people. I will tell you this: our lovely, woke independent bookstores have, they wouldn't carry the Robert F. Kennedy book on Fauci. I went to all of them in my area. I got treated like garbage just asking the question. So I'm not going through that again. I'm not a fan of Amazon, but what am I going to do? How else am I going to get this book out? So try not to be persnickety, please. This is where the book's available.
I think we all get it. It's a struggle with a lot of stuff.
Has anybody ever packed? I mean, I've done this because you've probably done this too, David, because we're in similar businesses. Has everybody personally packed 30 books up for mailing in a single day? It's not a quick thing. And somebody's got to take those fellows to the post office and wait online. I mean, it's a job. So the other thing, and believe me, I don't want to sing Amazon's praises, but if you have something that you need to get out to the world, it is very hard to get it out. You can be on podcasts, you can, have a Substack, you can do all these different things, but a book is very impactful, but the book is very expensive, right? There's the pre-production, writing it, researching it, editing it, copying it, laying it out, getting the cover. It's all production work. But the real bear is the printing. Normally, in the old days, you'd have to print 1,000 copies, minimum order. They're not going to print one copy for you. Anybody ever seen 1,000 books on a pallet? It comes on a pallet. Actually, it comes on 2 pallets, and they take up a lot of space. So the beauty of Amazon, and no one's all bad, is they do on-demand printing. So I send them a computer file, and I'm done. I don't have to give for this book to print, and I need 1,000 copies. I'm looking at, not a huge amount, but I'm looking at like a $3,500 check to the printer. And I got to find storage for those guys for, maybe I'm not going to sell 1,000 and then I've got to eat them, right? You know what I mean? So Amazon, I just have to say this because I know there's all these Amazon, haters, and I'm not an Amazon lover, but they do the print on demand. They spare me the agony of all that. And they spare me the agony of the shipping. And they spare me the agony of customer service if it arrives damaged and all this stuff. And we've priced it, and they're making a mint on it because I'm estimating they probably cost them about $3 and change to print this, maybe a little bit more, right? And I'm making $1. right? That's what my cut of the whole sale price is $1, and everything else is going. Am I happy with that? No, I'm not. Do I want to get this information out to the public? Yes, I do. So,
Well, with that being said, Ken, we have a person by the name of RR that says this information needs to be shared on a larger scale. Would you consider networking with 1, the Highwire with Del Bigtree? They do website each week in Rumble. I think they have about 8 million followers. Number 2, FLCCC Alliance. They do Zoom each week in Rumble. And number 3, VSRF, the Vaccine Safety Research Foundation. They do a Rumble each week. So that's just a quick thought from RR. But I also wanted to.
I love that.
Yeah.
I just have to say, all these organizations and others that you didn't mention are, I'm not going to say they're impenetrable, but they're pretty hard to get. It's hard to get their attention. It's really hard to get their attention. So I'd love to be on all of those shows, and that would be because this is the missing piece. We all know about the masks. We all know about, we kind of know about remdesivir. We know about the insanity of closing the schools and churches. We know about the vaccines. Nobody knows about this hospital setup. And it killed. That's where people were killed. We all know they didn't die of COVID. Some people, I guess, died of something like COVID, but this is where the death occurred. And we haven't even put a scratch on this in terms of public awareness. This is it. Why? And this is the thing I got to ask. And somebody asked me how I came to write this book. Well, I saw these 2 interviews, and I thought surely some investigative journalist, and I'm going to call them out, some multi-million-dollar nonprofit resistance group with 30 employees, many of whom are getting 6-figure salaries. Surely one of those groups is going to do something and talk to these nurses. And I waited, and 2020 passed, and 2021 passed, and 2022 passed, and half of two. And I said, by God, they're not going to do a thing about this. So that's why I wrote the book, not because I needed another project. I had to hire a full-time guy to help me, and I said to him, if I ever take on another book like this, just tell me no. Just say you're not going to do it. And then I violated it right away I just got to give a pitch for this book. This is the complete case that South Africa filed against Israel. And I know people have different feelings about that, but believe me, if you knew the facts of this thing, anyway, if you don't know what's going on, this is not a bad book to inform you. It also has the full text of the Genocide Convention. It also has the full text of the U.S. laws. Anyway, we got that. This paper got filed Friday, a week ago, and this thing was already in print on Tuesday. So we spent the whole weekend making this thing real, and I couldn't do that by any other means than Amazon. Anyway, sidebar.
Well, maybe
however, I got to say this: it's very similar. It's very different in the way it looks and the form it's taking, but more. I don't want to compare because what's happening over there is a horror beyond belief. Anybody that's inadvertently backing this because they don't know the details, you're going to hate yourself years later when you find out how horrific this was. Don't buy the bullshit soft peddling that the news media is doing. This is as horrible as it gets. But I got to tell you this: more people were dying per month here. And it was a system, and it was a propagandized system. And the reason it was able to take place in our hospitals was because of the density of the propaganda. And the same reason this is going on is the same general structure. Everybody thinks they know what's going on because they listen to CNN, and they don't know the true, absolute horror of it. But in terms of number of people killed, so far, I'm afraid in Gaza it's going to hit 100,000 because they're not stopping. And the public health thing, when that starts kicking in, the starvation and the lack of sewage and the lack of medical care, that's going to be one of the most horrible things that humanity has ever seen, done in freaking broad daylight, right? But this isn't that much different. I'll give you another, if you don't mind me going on a tangent. long decades ago, they came up with something called the neutron bomb. Does anybody remember that? They were all happy that they'd come up with a neutron bomb. And the virtue of the neutron bomb was you could kill all the people and all the buildings would remain standing, because it was basically a radiation it would just go out and just kill everybody, but it wouldn't knock any buildings down. That's what this was, functionally. The hospitals are still there. Everybody got paid. Some people got rich, and all the people got killed. This is the old-fashioned way. This is Warsaw Ghetto, bombing the poor people in the Warsaw Ghetto in that period. They're doing it the old-fashioned way with bombs and missiles, but it's the same general thing. Sorry, I know that's not what people signed on for, and I know some people think they know what the real story is, but believe me, what happened here is going to come out. And anyway, I don't want to go. We're talking about this, so I'm going to talk about this.
All right.
But it's similar. It's very similar. And you have experts saying, "Oh, it's not so bad," and how do you know? And I think those Gazans are doing just fine. And we sent them some bread the other day. It's just anyway.
All right, Ken. Well, at Mask Off Minnesota, every meeting we have, we do not want to leave people in the fetal position in the corner. And we want them to do something to move the cart of medical freedom forward. So in Minnesota, we have mHealth Fairview, which is a big healthcare system, and they just implemented masking requirements for their staff. So all the staff that's working with patients are required to wear masks, of course, not the office people. So we want you to become active. We want you to contact Fairview and tell them that they should get rid of the masks for staff. So there's numerous ways you can do it. You could tweet them at maskoffmn.org/tweetstorm. We have a tweet ready for you with a hashtag that you could then send to mHealth Fairview via tweet, via Twitter, or X as it's not called. Another way you can do it. You ready, David?
Yeah.
All right.
This is actually on the president's LinkedIn. So go ahead and explain what this is all about here, Nicole.
Yeah, so James Hereford, that's his name. He's the president and CEO of mHealth Fairview. This is his LinkedIn page. If you go to his LinkedIn page and you see this little publication, right below it you can comment. And we want you to comment negatively about how he's requiring masks for staff. We want the president and CEO to get all this contact, like whether by Twitter, LinkedIn, and then we're also going to do mail. So he doesn't get a lot of mail from patients, doesn't get a lot of contact. We need him to know how we disapprove of the mask. So go to his LinkedIn page. It's right here, James Hereford. Under this publication, respond with a comment and tell him that you don't want the staff to be required to wear masks. Now, as always, whenever you contact, here are the rules. You need to be kind. You need to be civil and professional. Do not threaten. Don't use swear words. That's not effective. Here is his address, and this is the address of the office. He's president and CEO, James Hereford. That's the address, Riverside Avenue, Minneapolis. You can go to maskoffmn.org/Hereford, and you can find that. We also have a pre-printed letter for you, a template, if you would like to use it. Right? Is it on the website, David, the template?
Yeah, it's right here. So if you go to the maskoffmn.org/Hereford, which is that link that Nicole just mentioned, they'll bring up this document here. And you can see here's the address, and here is the sample letter that you can write to them, write to him. Now, obviously, it says your name down here. You would obviously replace that part with your own name. And then, of course, we obviously encourage you to customize this and make it personal to yourself, but keeping in mind those guidelines that Nicole mentioned about keeping respectful and refraining from using swear words and stuff like that. So I did want to throw this out there that Ken, you actually mentioned earlier in our meeting that, all the masks are gone. Well, actually, that's not the case anymore, Ken, because they are coming back. There's a rumor that another major medical system in Minnesota has them coming back as well. But as of right now, the only one that we're able to confirm is mHealth Fairview, which is the major medical hospital system in Minnesota. And we did show that screenshot. That was as of January 4th, 10 days ago. They made that post on their website that the masks are required for staff. So, it's a slippery slope. It's staff one day. Remember last time it was staff at first last time too. So it's a slippery slope here, folks.
And
That's
then
why
it's
it's very
patience,
important.
right? And then it's patience. And the other thing is, you're welcome to customize the letter. Here's another thing you can do. Super simple. It's kind of what we did for the Canadian truckers. Use that address an envelope, and print on the inside, just remove masks from staff. No masks for staff. I mean, you don't even have to put a fancy, wording together or anything. Just make it simple. Be respectful. Don't threaten. Don't use swear words. But other than that, it could be just, again, a mask, word and a line through it. That's it. Send it to the CO. If we can get a bunch of people to do that, they will take note. Okay, they will take note. But we we can't just sit on the sidelines. We all got to do our part. If everybody does a little bit, this will take 5 minutes out of your time. Go do it. It'll have an impact. Trust me. All right.
And letters are more impactful than tweets or email. Do whatever you can, but if you can write a letter, way better.
Yes, agreed. Yes, it's physical. You're looking at it. They're required to open the mail. And trust me, the person who opens his mail is going to be like, oh, shoot, we got 15 letters, 20 letters, 50 letters, all people upset about the mask in all different ways. This is not good, because they know that if 50 people write him, there's, 5,000 people that are upset that aren't writing him or more. So.
And it's that footsteps behind the wide receiver thing. It's like, ooh, people are watching this. This is not a risk-free game anymore.
Correct. And you know what, Ken? They didn't announce this on the news that they were bringing back the masks for staff. So they're not announcing this because they know it's not popular. They're trying to fly under the radar. Let's make sure they know we know, and we're not okay with it.
Great.
And, part of Mask Off Minnesota, we've been really proud of our members because we call them RATs, real action takers. Because, how we all started was, people back in the early 2020 would all just be complaining about the government, complaining about the restrictions, about the lockdowns, but no one's taking action. Everyone's really good at complaining, but no one's taking actions. That's kind of how we all start off as an action-based activist group, citizen-run grassroots activist group, is because we all were folks that wanted to take action against this tyranny that was coming down on us, And I will say too, writing a letter obviously is the best option to get that CEO's attention. But as far as the court of public opinion, those letters won't get read by anyone in the public. If you comment on his LinkedIn, everyone else on his LinkedIn will see your comments.
Yeah.
If you do these tweets, other people in the public will see these tweets. So there is value to also doing these, the digital options as well, that other people can see and can join in on this movement as well. A lot of people don't even know. Like Nicole said, they didn't announce this on the news. I wonder why. I wonder why they didn't announce this on the news. So I think it's really important that we can attack all angles here as best as possible. So so thank you so much, Ken, for coming on here. Thank you, Nicole, for hosting. Thank you so much, Mark Bashofsky, for coming on as well. I know we Mark had to say goodbye a little bit ago, but as you folks know, let me just advance here to the very end. Remember, you're not alone. We all started off, a lot of us felt alone at the very beginning when we had our first in-person meetings. Everyone was so relieved to find like-minded people that we could, sit down and talk to and not feel like, we're on different sides of the equation, especially with the mask thing and all the other nonsense they're pushing up against us. But as you folks know, we also, as Mask Off Minnesota, usually like to end with a music video, an independent artist, something that you'll never see on MTV, something that you'll never see on the radio or hear on the radio or Sirius XM or anything like that. Now, we have gotten a lot of feedback that we do play a lot of independent alternative rap artists. So tonight we're going to try something a little bit different. We have a hard rock artist, and this gentleman's name is the Conspiracy Music Guru. Don't let that name throw you off, by the way. This music video is all about television watching news believers. All right, so we alluded to a little bit earlier about how people buy into the news propaganda, and that's without the news, without all the propaganda, I think it's safe to say that a lot of the last what the tyranny we've gone through the last few years would not have been nearly as effective. And the problem with a lot of people just blindly believe the news, especially local news, Everyone, for some reason, we have these local news characters that we buy into. They're real people, and so we feel we know, like, and trust them. We see them every night in the news. So don't be fooled by that, folks, because they're literally just actors. They're paid actors on TV. Yes, they might be local. Yes, they might have real families locally, but they're literally paid actors reading a script to you, pushing a narrative to you, pushing agendas to you every single night. So it's up to us to read between the lies And also up to us to maybe not even turn on the TV news anymore. All right, but we're going to go and end our Mask Off Minnesota meeting, our first meeting of 2024, our fourth meeting with Ken McCarthy, with television watching news believer by the conspiracy music guru. Please enjoy, folks, and good night.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories aren't true without checking facts first. Unfortunately,
of you, we're in this mess. Forever you will acquiesce. How you love to be deceived. Whatever they tell you, you believe. Get of sight, get of mind, news believer, you are blind. Critical thinker, you are not. Never independent thought. Box into your paradigm. Hypnotized with pantomime. Regurgitating all you hear. Spread your terror, spread your fear. Never your mind to be free. Never your eyes will ever see. Lick the boot of tyranny, begging for your slavery. They who have remote control, the TV know your very soul. Tune into the great deceiver, television watching news believer. Inject your poison, wear your mask. All they have to do is ask. Never questioning authority. Blindly following like sheep. Yes sir, no sir, freebacks fool. You television watching fool. Never your mind to be free. Never your eyes will ever see. Lick the boot of tyranny, begging for your slavery. They who have remote control, the TV know your very soul. Tune into the great deceiver, television watching news believer. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. Extremely dangerous to our democracy. This is 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 extremely dangerous to our democracy. In their world forever locked. Into their world forever boxed. Reality you leave behind. A prisoner of your own mind. Forever you will be deceived, never ever to be free. Never your mind to be free. Never your eyes will ever see. Lick the boot of tyranny, begging for your slavery. They who have remote control, the TV know your very soul. Tune into the great deceiver, television watching news believer. Never your mind to be free. Never your eyes will ever see. Lick the boot of tyranny, begging for your slavery. watching news believer.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy. This is extremely